It is 3 minutes after 10, and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where I kind of wondered whether, with a new government, the days of us staring, befuddled at something unfolding in the public space, something being said by a prominent person, as opposed to, Billy Buncher numbers with the Bulldog avatar on Twitter, staring befuddled at something happening in the public space might be in retreat, might be over, or at least paused. And in this country, I think perhaps they are. Although if you've had a look at hard man of Brexit, Steve Baker's Twitter profile recently, you'll realise that there are still some deeply befuddling things going on in front of us. But JD Vance is not some anonymous Twitter account with a bulldog avatar and lots of flag emojis in his descriptions. He's an extremely intelligent human being who wrote a beautiful book. Well, not a beautiful book. He wrote a very good book called Hillbilly Elegy, which sought to sort of track the state of the abandoned parts of America, or the parts of America that feel abandoned. And it was compelling. He also compared Donald Trump to Adolf Hitler not that long ago in a message to friends, and spoke very powerfully about what a grave threat Donald Trump posed to all manner of American institutions and freedoms. But he's been on what I believe the Americans like to call a journey, and he has ended up both as the vice presidential running mate of Donald Trump in November's election and a kind of anointed recipient of great largesse from various billionaires with questionable views. Two of them set up PayPal, actually, a guy called Peter Thiel and, of course, Elon Musk. Both seem to be big fans of this guy, or at least big fans of wherever it is that he's ended up. But he's also ended up saying some very strange things about this country. 6 minutes after 10 is the time. And I think it's worth actually listening to them, because I don't understand what is going on. I've got theories, I've got thoughts, which I will share with you shortly. But I think you need to get your ears around this first.
By the way, I have to beat up on the UK just one additional thing. I was talking with a friend recently, and we were talking about, one of the big dangers in the world, of course, is nuclear proliferation, though, of course, the Biden administration doesn't care about it. And I was talking about, what is the first truly Islamist country that will get a nuclear weapon? And we were like, maybe it's Iran, maybe Pakistan already kind of counts. And then we sort of finally decided maybe it's actually the UK, since Labour just took over. But to my Tory friends, I have to say, you guys have got to get a handle on this, but neither here nor there. By the way, I have to...
So I think he's joking, right? Right? But I don't even understand it as a joke. I don't even get why it would be funny to that audience, or indeed why he would even phrase or coin this phrase. So that, I guess the first question we've got for you is what is actually going on here? So my initial theory was that he is the kind of intellectual wing of Billy Buncher numbers with a bulldog avatar, and that he believes that kind of stuff about no-go zone. Do you remember we had a caller about, 2 or 3 weeks ago? I forget precisely where from, but he was adamant that Sadiq Khan had introduced what he called Shakira law already in several London boroughs, and was keen to do the same in several others. Sadiq Khan, of course, has won 3 mayoral elections, and the notion of him somehow representing the absence or a lack of integration is laughably absurd. But not as absurd as somebody living in this country, breathing the same air that you breathe, drinking the same water that you drink, and concluding that the Mayor of London, who is a Muslim, but a Muslim widely respected and praised by other communities, most notably the Jewish community, in the context of some of these claims, that's most notable, would introduce Shakira, as he called it, law, and that Britain or London is full of no-go zones. I always read American Twitter accounts, or indeed completely anonymous Twitter accounts, telling me that I live in a city where that there are places that I can't go, that there are areas that I would be too frightened to walk in, or something like that. And I mean, that's obviously nonsense. But even if that were true, and there was some ethnicity-related reason why you might avoid a certain part of town, how does that translate into nuclear power or nuclear bombs? I sometimes hesitate to ask the question, what on earth is he talking about? But when it is somebody poised to become the Vice President of the United States of America, and when he is talking about us, I think you have to ask this question. What is he actually talking about? What is he doing? And I stress again, the man is not stupid. Not by any stretch of the imagination is he stupid. He's not Trumpian. He's not possessed of a kind of diabolical genius that is somehow hitched to an almost performative ignorance, impossible to unravel the mysteries of what makes Trump simultaneously so compelling and so obviously stupid. Vance is as bright as a button. He's changed his mind a million times, so often, in fact, that you have to question his authenticity and his sincerity. As we often say on this program, there's no point having a mind if you never change it. But if you're changing it every day, then there's probably very little point in having a mind in those circumstances either. So he is categorically not stupid. So why did he say this? Who is he talking to and what is he talking about? I'm getting messages now saying it's not Shakira law, it's Sharia law, James. Sorry, I should have clarified. My caller kept calling it Shakira law, which I thought was quite emblematic of the kind of person that signs up to this sort of nonsense. He didn't even know the correct word to use, which in this context would be Sharia. So sorry, I presumed you'd heard the call, you'd heard the clip, and I didn't need to explain that. And what was really interesting about that call, I think it was one of the most interesting calls we've taken on the programme in the context of what I think J.D. Vance is flirting with here, was that we did a live on-air fact check. The fact that he got that word wrong and the fact that he spoke so confidently about the number of boroughs that had been affected and the fact that I think he said he'd seen it in the news just made me think it must be one of those lies that is viral. It must be one of those viral memes, if you like, that get picked up in all sorts of places on the internet, to the point where I make jokes about your Auntie Doris's Facebook page or your Uncle Keith's Facebook page. People end up believing, it takes us all the way back to Brexit, they end up believing the nonsense that is popping up on their social media feeds. And the way that the algorithms work is such that once you've shown a little bit of interest in this kind of nonsense, your social media feed will fill up with it. It's as if the Daily Mail could actually sort of reprogram your social media feeds to fill them with the kind of builds that happily used to be confined to the Daily Mail. And I'm always slightly torn between laughing at people who find themselves down such rabbit holes to the point of calling Sharia law Shakira law while talking utter bilge about it, and troubled because, you know, his vote is worth the same as your vote. He could live on your street, could be in your family, you could be sitting next to him at work today. And that's worrying. That people can believe such crazy stuff is deeply worrying. But when Donald Trump's choice of vice president suggests that Labour will make the UK the first truly Islamist country with nuclear weapons, and when it is reported in the kind of newspapers that have helped to create this febrile atmosphere with shock, the Daily Mail reports it today with shock and disapproval, I don't understand what J.D. Vance thinks that he's doing. I think, and I need to double check this, that in numbers terms, in purely statistical terms, there are roughly the same number of Muslims in America than there are in the UK, perhaps slightly more, but obviously in percentage terms, given our colonial history, the figure's going to be much higher. But that's people who identify as Muslim. Islamist is a completely different definition. And yet J.D. Vance sees fit to sort of bandy it about in this kind of context. So it's categorically important to this question that J.D. Vance is a very clever man, right? He's a very clever man. So what's he doing? 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. J.D. Vance is a very clever man, likely to become what I suppose is technically the second most powerful man in the world next year, if the polls stay as they are now. And he is describing the UK as Well, potentially becoming, because there's a Labour government, potentially becoming the first truly Islamist country with nuclear weapons. And not for the first time in recent years. I am completely baffled as to what the point here may be. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. Let's keep it friendly. Don't ring me up and tell me that, we are living under Sharia law or Shakira law. It has to be evidence-based. And remember, I live in London. I live in Brentford in London, a very diverse and multicultural area, like all big cities are, but London, I think, in particular. So and I grew up in the West Midlands. So the idea of someone sitting in the boondocks in the United States of America who thinks we're all living under some sort of Islamist jackboot, I can just about get my head around. It's tragic when you read that, or you know that people who are living in Surrey or Blackpool have been persuaded by online nonsense that there's some. But what is J.D. Vance doing? Who is he talking to, and what is he talking about? 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. Who is he talking to? Because it's not us. And what is he talking about? Hit the numbers now. You will get through. 17 minutes after 10. And I mean, even if it is a joke, it's a joke built on something. And I don't know what it's built on. Have another listen and then we'll hit the phones.
By the way, I have to beat up on the UK just one additional thing. I was talking with a friend recently, and we were talking about, one of the big dangers in the world, of course, is nuclear proliferation, though, of course, the Biden administration doesn't care about it. And I was talking about, what is the first truly Islamist country that will get a nuclear weapon? And we were like, maybe it's Iran, maybe Pakistan already kind of counts. And then we sort of finally decided maybe it's actually the UK, since Labour just took over. But to my Tory friends, I have to say, you guys have got to get a handle on this, but neither here nor there. By the way, I have to...
So there are answers to this question because he knows his room and the room like it. But we're supposed to be an ally. Nigel Farage is going to be furious. You know how he feels about American politicians trying to get involved in British politics. He's, and you know how consistent and honest he is. So he's going to be absolutely livid. And I think he's probably there, isn't he? He's probably, and maybe he's the bloke that J.D. Vance was talking to. I don't know, but he's going to be absolutely furious that an American politician is trying to get involved in British politics. But he knows the room. He knows what he's saying. He knows what buttons he's pushing. And at this point, I don't quite know what buttons he's pushing because I can't see him in the same light as Billy Bunch of Numbers with the Bulldog avatar and 407 flag emojis in his Twitter profile. Julian's in Sunbury-on-Thames. Julian, what would you like to say?
Oh, good morning, James. First-time caller.
Welcome.
So a bit nervous.
Crikey, you've picked one, haven't you? Go on then, fill your boots.
I think this all boils down to Trump's relationship with Sadiq Khan. There's no great secret that both absolutely loathe each other and did when they were in the presidency. And J.D. Vance is setting his stall politically to be in favour with the big man, so to speak, when he presumes he's going to win the election in November.
It's going to be part of it, isn't it? But it's not. I mean, that would explain some sort of lazy, quasi-racist rhetoric. But the bit about nuclear bombs, or nuclear weapons, I don't understand where that fits into to any analysis at the moment.
I think it's just raising it to a level where it pricks the ears up, so to speak, amongst certain communities in the USA that would have those sort of fears and bias, possibly about the UK. But
we've got. We've got a Muslim mayor of London, and I think one or two Muslim cabinet members, both under this government and under the previous one. Are there people in America that believe that we are a country whose politics is dominated by people of the Muslim faith? Because I think there are. There are people in America. I mean, to be fair, we've got our mate who thinks that we're all living under Shakira law in London, so it's probably not that shocking that it would happen in America. But for a clever person like J.D. Vance, I suppose the question that neither of us will ever be able to answer is, does he know he's talking nonsense and deliberately appealing to people who believe nonsense, or is there something more subtle and sophisticated going on?
I think he knows he's talking nonsense. I think he's playing to a particular audience. He's now stepped up, quite a few leagues into sort of premier political lead in America, and he needs to be seen to be allying with his running mate.
Yeah, no, okay, and this would be one way of doing it, and the question of what the people in the room are actually laughing at is one that perhaps can only be answered by the people laughing in the actual room. Andreas is in Copenhagen. Andreas, what would you like to say?
Well, hello. Thank you for taking my call.
You're most welcome.
I'm quite confused. Well, I'm quite confused about your confusion, to be honest, James,
oh, no. Well, I'm confused. I'm confused about your confusion about my confusion now, Andreas.
Well, we could go on forever like this, couldn't we? No, I believe this is just a pretty run-of-the-mill conservative anti-immigration sort of rhetoric that he's dealing with. So the United Kingdom does have nuclear weapons. The United Kingdom just got a progressive government. The United Kingdom, therefore, in the minds of a certain kind of right-wing headbanger, is in danger of opening up the door for a bunch of Muslim immigrants, which is, of course, going to make the United Kingdom, in their mind, an Islamist country, which means that the United Kingdom will then become the first Islamist country with nuclear weapons. He doesn't necessarily believe that. He's just trying to appeal to the sort of to the base that Donald Trump is also appealing to, and maybe he's trying to make himself more, with the comments that he's previously made about Donald Trump, make himself more delicious, more appetizing, as it were.
I like the use of the word
base.
Delicious. That's perfect.
Yes, well, I'm struggling a bit with my
you're doing a heck of a lot better than my friend who rang in to talk about Shakira Law, and he had English as his first language. But I don't.
Funny. I was listening to that, and that was.
Well,
funny.
is that the kind of because he's not? If he's appealing to him, the kind of British equivalent of a redneck, as it were, then I get it all. But this is a sophisticated gathering, so this is yet more evidence that the kind of rhetoric that you describe, the kind of provocations that you describe, are mainstream now in the Republican Party. They reach right to the very top. It's not just about whipping up the base while patronising them and thinking that. I guess I'm asking: does Vance believe what he's saying, or is he just appealing to people who do?
I don't think it matters what these people believe, because their policy is not about what they believe in. It's about getting power and making themselves wealthy on the back of that.
And therefore, it would make sense. So I'm still confused. I'm possibly a little bit less confused. Your analysis is quite straightforward, but it alienates the UK. It's objectively gibberish, but it appeals to people who believe gibberish. It can't go all the way, can it, Andreas? That can't be the beginning and the end of the analysis. There must be something a bit subtler going on here.
Well, I mean, there might be something. I certainly. Well, I'm not so sure that there is something more subtle going. Maybe I'm not clever enough to see it. Who knows?
Well, maybe I'm not either. Or maybe you are, and you're seeing it in exactly the simple and straightforward terms that it deserves. I suppose, people are pointing out Liz Truss is at this gathering, Boris Johnson is at this gathering, Nigel Farage is at this gathering. These are not politicians whose relationship with the truth or with the best interests of Great Britain have been on particular display lately. So the idea of denigrating the UK in order to raise a titter in Milwaukee, I still don't get it. Why the nuclear threat? Why is that funny? Why is he doing it? And I'm not alone. I want to stress this. The Daily Mail writes it up this morning in confused and disapproving terms, and it's very rarely that I find myself in the same sort of space as the Daily Mail. 24 minutes after 10 is the time. Arwad is in Barnet. Arwad, what would you like to say?
Hi. First of all, thank you for being so nice to me last time we spoke.
I suppose the pressure's on now. Carry on.
I don't think he believes in any of it, because I remember either in tweet form or in a private message, J.D. Vance particularly rebuked Trump's hatred of minorities and Muslims.
Yes.
So I don't think he believes in it, but he sees a market. And
But what's the market? Because I understand base Islamophobia or base racism or base anti-migrant rhetoric, but and maybe I'm overthinking things, but this seems to me to be of a different order. There's something else going on here.
You mentioned sophistication.
Yes.
I'll give you two names. Tommy 10 Names and Douglas Murray.
What was the first one?
Tommy 10 Names.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Douglas Murray.
Right.
Tommy 10 Names.
Who are both very committed to persuading people that we are all living under grave threat from all Muslims.
Yeah.
Yes.
Tommy 10 Names is a very, 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 But here's the difference.
Go on.
Tommy Ten Names is generally a pariah. He's not generally invited on mainstream news quite often. But
Yes.
Douglas Murray,
I think he was for a while.
regularly appears.
I think I'm told he's Rupert Murdoch's favourite journalist. I don't know whether that's true or not, but I was told it by someone at the Times. So you're talking about, and I think that the word is often rejected by the people in the kind of space you describe, but you're talking about Islamophobia and the Islamophobia in a suit and tie versus Islamophobia in a bomber jacket.
Yeah.
And what J.D. Vance is doing is Islamophobia in a suit and tie.
Absolutely.
So why bring nuclear bombs into it then?
I think I don't think even the people he was preaching to genuinely thought that Islamists were going to get a hold of nuclear bombs in the UK. But there's an undertone there.
Yes.
So, for example, if you say, let's say that Shabana Mahmood is going to launch a nuke, that would be called out quite quickly. But if you weave it in and joke about it, then you have an air of deniability.
So you're just trying to make people think ill of the Muslims and then of the UK or then of the UK government, and the nuclear bomb is just a sort of quasi-comedic device to achieve that or to push that point.
Yeah. I'm a big fan of Saida Warsi, and I remember she mentioned that in her time in government, she was constantly harassed with accusations of entryism. And I point to Vance's mention of the Labour government. I think he's preaching to a crowd who see that Labour has a higher proportion of Muslim MPs or MPs who are quite open about their Muslim faith, and trying to sort of weave in, they're taking over the government. Look at Sadiq Khan. He's a Muslim. He's taken over. But he knows which words to pick. And I think that's the most dangerous, because Douglas Murray, in his ideas, is no different to Tommy Ten Names. But because he's able to weave them, the difference is, ultimately, that Tommy Ten Names is generally ostracized, but Douglas Murray can be a #1 Sunday Times bestseller.
Okay, I mean, neither of those people are here to challenge what you've said, but I think the idea that they promote a sense that we should all be fearful of the Muslim faith or Muslim people is probably unchallengeable. And J.D. Vance is deliberately and consciously moving into the respectable side of the space that you describe. And then the nuclear weapons just become a kind of a lever or an umbrella under which to just kind of try to conflate Islamism with liberalism, Islamism with progressivism, Islamism with left-wing politics. And I guess that probably does have quite a hungry audience. Oh, well, thank you. I can see why I was so nice to you the last time you came on the programme. Very thoughtful contributions. It's coming up to 10:30. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where the question is, and let me read you the first paragraph of the comment page, the main comment page in the Daily Mail newspaper. Was it terrifying ignorance or outrageous cynicism? Either would explain the recent remark by J.D. Vance, Donald Trump's new pick for vice president, that Britain is now effectively an Islamist state. Was it terrifying ignorance or outrageous cynicism? I think the consensus on this programme so far is outrageous cynicism all day long. It is 10:30 and Amelia Cox has your headline. 10:32 is the time. What is the first truly Islamist country that will get a nuclear weapon? The likely next vice president of the United States of America asked a conference last week in Washington. And the fact that it's last week is significant. Answer, it could be the United Kingdom. Cue laughter. I think Emma may have nailed something or certainly developed the point that Arwad was making. It's a different base from Trump's. Trump scoops up the Rust Belt, the common man. Vance scoops up the old money, who can be just as racist but run in different comedic circles. So they like their bigotries dressed up differently. And that's what he's done. But I'm still not quite there, not quite seeing it as clearly as you may be seeing it, but maybe that's my fault. Cecilia is in Tottenham. Cecilia, what would you like to say?
Oh, good morning, James. This is a great question, by the way, and I'm hoping that my experience of travelling around the US last year for 4 months can shed some light upon it. Due to a meeting, I met somebody in Lynchburg, Virginia, when I was travelling through. So I went around the States using Amtrak to see what the rumbles on the ground were. And I met a 75-year-old-ish man, very educated, very erudite. He'd done some sort of scholarship at Winchester. He'd studied archaeology. He was very invested in English history. He supported Tottenham Hotspurs, but let's not make judgments there. Sorry.
So he was an Anglophile. He was an Anglophile.
He was an Anglophile, yes. And obviously he wanted to talk about politics. Now, on the subject of Sadiq Khan, he had a lot of opinions about it, but I got the impression that in America they conflate the role of the Mayor of London to be far bigger than it is. So Sadiq Khan becomes this consistent figurehead, as there has been for the last few years, as that he's always been in the centre of everything. And, of course, we know that's wrong, and that's taken a few leaps of logic as well to get there. But the key thing that I took away, I mean, because I had suspended my bias, when it was very apparent he was a massive Trump supporter, because he was so interesting. What it all seemed to boil down to, the nub of where, because he hadn't been to Europe for many, many years, and he was saying he missed it, he was saying he missed the UK, he wanted to go travelling again, but he couldn't because he was scared of flying, and he hadn't flown since 9/11. And that's what it boiled down to.
So that atavistic fear is still in place almost, and you can feed into it by conflating peaceable politicians who may be Muslims or may just have brown skin, because that conflation is fairly commonplace as well, into the fear of terrorism, which is where the word Islamism fits in, as opposed to the word Islamic. So the more we talk about it, the easier it becomes to understand, and the more obnoxious his intervention appears to be. The more deliberately obnoxious and deliberately unpleasant.
Well, this man was so intelligent and so sweet, and honestly one of the nicest people I've ever met.
Oh wow!
And I was curious.
He just believed this stuff.
Oh yes.
While being all of those things.
Yes, and I convinced him from our long conversation that not to be scared of Europe, and if he didn't want to fly, there are cruise boats that leave from New York, and he and his wife need a holiday. But he did. Did you really convince him? Did he walk away? He did, really. Well done. Yeah,
he walked away.
I put him on the website looking at cruise boats. It's like you don't need to be. You don't need to be scared of going to Europe. You're welcome.
I sometimes think, Cecilia, thank you. I sometimes think that the great liberal disease is to be a little bit, not overly optimistic, but to be a little bit naive, perhaps, about how straightforward some of these tactics can be. Here is a Muslim mayor of London. Here are a bunch of Americans who are frightened of Islamist terrorism. Why not pretend that they are both symptoms of the same malaise? And if that is what J.D. Vance is speaking to, then David Lammy's decision to describe him as a friend after meeting him in Washington in may well be something that Sadiq Khan will want to pick him up on next time they break bread together. So even the shadow veterans minister, so senior Conservative Andrew Bowie, I disagree with the Labour Party fundamentally on many issues, but I do not agree with that view. It's actually quite offensive. And it's not even the most important element internationally of what J.D. Vance potentially represents. That would probably be his explicit belief that America's got no business helping Ukraine, which is the subject that saw Boris Johnson pop back up yesterday, reported today to be urging Donald Trump to continue to support Ukraine in the event of him regaining the White House in November. It is 10:38. It is an extraordinary intervention from, I suppose you have to describe him now as one of the most senior politicians in America, albeit that he's only really been a politician for just under a couple of years, talking about one of America's historic allies and saying things that are, the more we examine them, objectively obnoxious. 10:38 is the time. Peter is in Haringey. Peter, what would you like to say?
I think J.D. Vance is talking some sense here. about Labour. Labour is at the mercy of the Muslim vote and Muslim extremists in certain areas of this country.
Right.
They've lost MPs in the last general election.
Yeah, but
to the Muslim vote.
That means that they're not part of the Labour government. The people the people you're talking about. If they've defeated Labour MPs in constituencies, then they're not part of the Labour government that JD Vance is talking about.
Yeah, but if Labour want to get back in there, then they're going to have to kowtow to.
But they've just secured one of the biggest parliamentary majorities in the history of the United Kingdom. Why would they be kowtowing to anyone?
Well, if they want to get back into power in those areas, where they've had secure seats, which they will want to do, then they're going to have to adjust their policies in that area, or they'll try to.
But
anyway.
they literally just won more seats than pretty much any other party in history. Why would they be obsessing or prioritising a handful of seats where they lost by fairly slim margins? Some people argue over their early policies regarding Israel's atrocities in Gaza. I don't understand where the kowtowing comes in for a government with an absolutely enormous majority. Or indeed why JD Vance would describe that government as being Islamist when you're explaining to us, I think, that it's actually Muslim candidates who you might describe as Islamist. I don't think I would. They've defeated Labour candidates. So how can they simultaneously be beating Labour and in Labour?
Well, I mean, I think he's exaggerating the whole thing, but he's just saying that Labour... You
just said he was talking sense.
Pardon?
You just said he was talking sense.
Well, yeah, but in those areas where Labour had secure seats for years, if they want to get back in there, they're going to have to...
But they won loads of seats where the Conservatives had secure seats for years. Are they going to have to kowtow? Are they going to have to kowtow to the Conservatives as well?
Well, for now they have, but that's only a protest vote against the Tories. I think a lot of those will go. But the
votes you describe are literally a protest vote against Labour's policy in Gaza. Have you thought this through, Peter?
Yeah, obviously it's a protest vote, but it's an absurd vote because we're not going to decide what happens in Gaza.
No.
So But
the Labour Party is going to decide what its policy is. We're not going to decide what happens in Ukraine, but we have a policy regarding Ukraine. We're not going to decide what happens in America next year, but we will have policies regarding America. I'm just going to read a message. I'm so embarrassed to be from Harrogate right now, but you don't need to be, Jim Bob. Peter's in Haringey. I think that's my pronunciation that's wrong. So JD Vance has a point because Labour lost some seats to pro-Gaza politicians.
Yeah.
Okay.
So if they want to get back in those areas...
Why has he brought the nuclear weapons into it then?
Well, it's just a bit of hyperbole. I mean, obviously the government will control defence and control, the nuclear weapons. So, he's just bringing that in as a bit of a joke and an exaggeration.
Right. Okay.
So, I'm just explaining, I think, how he sees it. It's a bit of a joke about, Labour situation.
So the Labour government is an Islamist government because it just lost some seats to some Muslim pro-Gaza candidates.
Now, I'm not saying they're an Islamist government, but they're at the mercy in certain areas of the
JD Vance
country
is. JD Vance is, isn't he?
Yeah, he said that, but I think...
But he's talking
they're
sense.
At the mercy.
But he's talking sense.
Well, yeah, but he's... Yeah,
Do you still think he's talking sense after we've...
well, he's a bit exaggerated. It's a bit of a joke comment, but he's sort of got some sense about that Labour is at the mercy of this Islamists and the Muslim vote.
But we've established that it isn't because it's just won its biggest majority ever. It's not at the mercy of anybody at the moment. Some people think that might be bad. So they're just round the corner then. The real threat.
Well, I mean, Labour's going to lose a lot of those seats in the future.
Yeah, well, not if they do all the kowtowing, to the Tories and the Islamists and the Lib Dems and the Greens and the Reformers. I mean, they'll be doing so much kowtowing, biggest majority in history. Okay, mate, have a great day. Love to the family. 10:43 is the time. Frank's in Broxbourne. Frank, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello, mate.
It's obvious. It's a power grab by the right wing. They're trying to. I mean, we never had we never had Farage. This is a way of American politicians getting appealing and trying to unite some sort of alliance with people like Farage. It's obvious, isn't it? I mean, the things that they're saying in America, anything will stick. Today it's Muslims and Islamists, and then it'll be LGBT, and then it'll be women's rights, and then it'll be civil rights. Anything that sticks.
Well, Vance has made comments about women staying in unhealthy or even violent relationships that speak a little bit to what you fear or predict. It's okay.
He's the same guy that called Trump Hitler a few years ago.
Yeah, what's
isn't he?
that about? I mean, do we know enough about him to understand how he's managed to undertake that sort of U-turn? Has he just got, the closer he's got to power, the more seduced he has become by it? So deep down in his
game,
or
he's playing a game,
he's playing the game.
Very good political game. Yeah,
and this is part of that process. So you see it as Edward Lucas asks in the Daily Mail today, and it's not often I find myself referring to the comment pages of the Daily Mail.
That's an independent paper. That's an independent new paper.
Yes, exactly. But was it terrifying ignorance or outrageous cynicism? You are under no doubt whatsoever that it is outrageous cynicism.
James, can I suggest something?
Of course you can.
If you want to better inform yourself, there's a guy that goes on the internet. He's called Cenk Uygur of TYT.
I need to have this stuff checked out beforehand. By all means, make recommendations on air, but you can't really make recommendations of stuff that we haven't been able to just double check. I'm sure you're a stand-up guy, Frank, but we do need to be a little bit careful about that. 10:45 is the time. I think that Pippa Crerar, the political editor of The Guardian, has come closest to pinpointing precisely why Rishi Sunak went so early on that general election. It remains, of course, a little bit baffling, not least to many defeated Tory candidates. But she's unearthed a frankly extraordinary story that you may not have seen yet, that I think speaks to two things. It speaks to the probable likely reason why he got tipped over the edge into making that decision. And as one of my friends pointed out on Twitter last night, it makes a complete mockery of my suggestion that he did it because he'd simply had enough of being Prime Minister. Or actually does it? It could be, they could both be true at the same time. He'd had enough of being Prime Minister, but he was planning on hanging in there until nearer to the end of the year. And then this thing happened that Pippa will tell us about shortly. And he just thought, sack it, I'm out. Let's have an election. 10:48 is the time. Why did he go so early? What was it? Did Rishi Sunak know something that we didn't know? Had he simply had enough? As his wife perhaps laid down an ultimatum and said, listen, it's not going very well, darling. It's probably time to have a little bit of a rethink. Goodness knows the toll it's taken on her. Never mind him. But it was fairly clear by the end of the election campaign that he was neither enjoying himself nor expecting to win. So why did he go against the advice, even of his closest advisors, and call the election so unexpectedly and so unnecessarily early? We'll never know until he writes his memoirs, if indeed he ever does, but we can speculate, and that speculation, I think, firms up slightly in at least one area with a story on the front page of today's Guardian by their inimitable political editor, Pippa Crerar. Pippa, what did you find out?
Hi, James. Good to be with you. So I was leaked a memo from a very senior individual in the Cabinet Office, which was a warning written sent a week before the general election was called in May to Rishi Sunak and his Justice Secretary at the time, Alex Chalk, about the state of prisons. We've all been reporting for some time, I know you've been discussing it on your show, about the prison capacity crisis, the fact that the men's estate was so overcrowded it had reached 99% of capacity since the start of 2023, which was putting it at the point of collapse. But what we didn't know until this point was that the Prime Minister had received a specific internal warning, rather than sort of, in meetings with civil servants and ministers, setting out what his legal and ministerial obligations were, and warning that if he didn't act now, so just before the election, the criminal justice system would reach a point in England and Wales of critical failure.
So pretty much what Shabana Mahmood told the country last week.
Yes, I mean, she has talked about the guilty men in Number 10 and the Prime Minister himself. Interestingly, civil servants that I've spoken to conservative politicians who were around at the time that I've spoken to suggested that this decision was not blocked by the Ministry of Justice, which is obviously packed with experts who have been calling for some time for what we call SDS 40, which is the standard determinate sentencing, the early release of prisoners once they've reached this, about 40% of their sentences to happen. They had been arguing that these other levers had been pulled, and ultimately really the only thing which was now going to work to avoid the collapse of the criminal justice system was bringing in this early release system. But that appeal had been blocked at every turn by Downing Street, who said that they thought it was complete hemlock, that it would be incredibly toxic politically. Presumably they knew at that point they were going to call an election, and they didn't want to have to do this at that point.
Well, I mean, because if they weren't calling an election when they did, the kind of omerta on the subject and the blocking would have become unsustainable. The collapse predicted by the civil servants would happen.
Yeah, I mean, they were warned, and there was a meeting a few days after this message, this letter was sent, this warning was sent from the Cabinet Office. There was a meeting on the Monday before Sunak called the election on the Wednesday at Downing Street, which included Alex Chalk, some of his Ministry of Justice aides, some Downing Street people, including the Deputy Chief of Staff, Will Tanner, and the Prime Minister, in which there's two quite different, and I've written about this in the piece, there's two quite different takes on this. You speak to people on the Ministry of Justice side, and they say that it was quite clear when Alex Chalk came back from that meeting that he felt he'd been given permission by the Prime Minister to press the button on the early release scheme, which would have let out thousands of prisoners early. Downing Street said the Downing Street at the time say that actually they had asked them to look at all the options.
Have we lost Pippa there, or I should just pause for a dramatic effect? No, I think we've lost. I think we've lost the line. I hope we get it back, because I think we just lost you temporarily. Alex,
sorry.
No, it's not your fault. Alex Chalk has given a couple of interviews since leaving the department and since leaving Parliament. Actually, one of the Tories who's lost his seat, in which he has sounded very much as if he felt that they should have done in government what Labour has done, whereas some Tories who've retained their seats have moved very quickly to try to condemn Labour for doing what they, or at least senior members of their own party, knew that they would have to do in the event of the election not being called.
Yeah, but I think some of those people are also among those that were basically the reason the government didn't do it, because ultimately they didn't do it because they didn't think they could get it past their own backbenches, even though they had a massive majority.
Up pops Suella Braverman.
Exactly. You had Suella Braverman, who at that point was trying to amend the sentencing bill, was opposing publicly, very publicly, any suggestion that you might there might be any release, but also trying to sort of increase sentences on sort of lesser crimes, if you like, which would have made the problem worse in the first place. Much of this problem, the prison population problem, reaching such extremes, was as a result of the government's decision during the pandemic not to release, like some other countries did, prisoners early. So there are sort of legitimate reasons for why it got so bad.
Of course.
But they didn't deal with
as
it
Home
for
Secretary,
years.
she would have known more about that than almost anybody else in the country, and yet by the time.
Then there's always this tension between the Home Office and the Ministry of Justice, and that the Home Office's responsibility, I guess, is to lock more people up, and the Ministry of Justice's responsibility is to deal with them in the state once they have been locked up. So that tension exists. But Suella Braverman and her ilk made it much harder for that Downing Street to be able to politically push through any early release scheme, even if Rishi Sunak had wanted to. And all the suggestions that we've had are that he didn't want to anyway.
What a fantastic story. And of course, Labour not in any way beset by the potential rebellions that you describe, and so able to get this through almost on day one. Finally, Pippa, I'm tempted by not the conspiracy theory, but by the Kremlinology. You clearly are not. You're far too professional and grown up. But if I've understood you correctly, it's more that they knew they were going to call the election that meant that they felt they didn't have to do anything, brackets, and they didn't want to anyway because it would be toxic at any point in an electoral cycle, close brackets, rather than, oh my God, this is going to be absolutely awful. We better call an election before it happens.
So I think there's a bit of both.
Okay.
I think the reality is that Rishi Sunak and those people around him who decided to go for the early election did so because they thought things would only get worse. And that meant only get worse on several fronts, primarily the economy, or rather, crucially, whether people felt any better off by the time of the autumn. But yes, of course, prisons was one of the areas of public services that they were most concerned about, along with the NHS and, of course, the small boats crossing the Channel. And of those key areas, they felt that things could only get worse. And that's why they say they went for the early election instead.
Wow, thank you. Pippa Crerar, thank you so much. Her exclusive is in The Guardian, indeed on the front page of The Guardian this morning. And as she said, it's a little bit of both. And it adds to the continuing quest, if you like, to answer the question of why he went so early. It's an absolutely superb bit of journalism, that. It really is. 10:55 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where let's hop back over the Atlantic briefly. Britain is now effectively an Islamist state. Said the future vice president, or the potential future vice president of the United States of America. That, I guess, we had at least one call from Haringey who would kind of agree with it, but struggle, I think it's fair to say, to provide really cogent or coherent reasons why you would agree with it. But Justice Suella Braverman would have been in possession of all the facts about the prisons crisis and yet still resist the only inevitable policy response to it because of the feelings of potential supporters. So the tension between facts and feelings in America remains. So J.D. Vance would almost certainly know that he's talking gibberish. And crucially, he would know that his gibberish would appeal to certain types of voters. And that, in a way, is the distillation of populism, I think. 10:56 is the time. Ben is in Brighton. Ben, what would you like to say?
It's interesting talking about sort of the rhetoric of J.D. Vance. I work around a lot of people that are supposedly not political. They don't watch the news and everything like that, but they come out with statements about Sadiq Khan and this, that, and the other. And I've actually said to them, I said that the strange thing is with especially Islam or Sharia law and all that sort of thing. And I said to them, as the strange thing is, I said, I believe you're slightly jealous. I said, because they believe that somebody should be bloody hung for doing wrong, for murder and all the other stuff. They misogynists tend to be.
Yeah.
I said it's an element of jealousy. I think, and the weird thing about it, it's like a full circle.
You're talking about the horseshoe theory, aren't you? Because Islamism as opposed to Islam. Yeah. The extremist ideologies are quite fascistic, and Donald Trump's base are also quite fascistic. Donald Trump himself is also quite fascistic. So oddly, they've got more in common with each other than they have with the rest of us. I think that's the point you're making.
Exactly that. I mean, I think I don't call them rednecks. I call them gammon necks.
Yeah, some people are very unhappy with that description, but then some people are unhappy with the redneck description as well. So that's what he's appealing to is the kind of people who display the views you have. I liked Emma's analysis, actually, possibly a little more, because Trump's already got that demographic sewn up. Whereas Vance is appealing to the suit and tie equivalent of the voters that Trump has been appealing to since he started. There was one superb comment that in many ways inspired this entire conversation from an American broadcaster who works for MSNBC called Chris Hayes, and looking at Vance, he wrote, something underappreciated in discussions of Vance and his ilk is the degree to which, yes, his ideological transformation is opportunistic, but also I think he and huge swathes of the modern right really have self-radicalized, largely online, and are constantly imbibing all kinds of genuinely monstrous, insane and bizarre ideas, and have come to believe them. That ties in with what Ben says about people who don't follow the news in the traditional sense. But Hayes goes on, a big part of modern right-wing culture is this frisson of the illicit, the reading of this or that writer or account who are outre in whatever ways, whether fascists, race IQ obsessives, Holocaust denial adjacent, or people with very weird sexual fixations and pathologies. They turn into their own philosophy. So a lot of them, and he thinks this is true of Vance, have simply pickled their brains. And that's why I started with the reference to the Billy Bunch of Numbers with a bulldog avatar who we see on Twitter having pickled their brains. But there's no reason why wealthy, intelligent, successful people can't pickle their brains too. It is 3 minutes after 11. I say this very, very hesitantly, but I think J.D. Vance might be scarier than Donald Trump. Very hesitantly, because Trump is obviously very scary. But do you not feel a bit sometimes with Donald Trump that, like Boris Johnson, if he thought that power, prestige and success would be delivered by adopting an entirely different... Well, actually, no, J.D. Vance fits into that category as well, doesn't he? But some of the stuff that he's come out with is more explicitly offensive than some of the stuff that or are they just peas in a pod? Are they just... We are effectively running this country by a bunch of childless cat ladies who are miserable at their own lives and the choices that they've made, and they want to make the rest of the country miserable too. So, you know, where Islamophobia rears its ugly head, misogyny is never far behind, a point that Ben in Brighton made. But that analysis from the American broadcaster Chris Hayes is something that I am enduringly fascinated by. As you know, what happens online to people who we once respected and in some cases still love. I think we did our best work together, as in you and me. I think we did our best work together during COVID, during the anti-vaccine conspiracies that grew up and the fractures that this kind of online self-radicalization delivered to the heart of relationships and families. I'll always remember speaking, it was usually to wives and girlfriends, but it was sometimes to husbands and boyfriends or siblings about the rabbit holes down which their loved ones had fallen and the absolute crackpot nature of the stuff that they believed. It's the closest I've ever come to the rabbit hole. Because I was getting messages, I told you at the time, from people that I hadn't been in touch with in some cases for 30 or 40 years, one of them. Just messaged me on Facebook, say, you're the only journalist I know. Can you just tell me whether or not there's any truth in this? And it was something about 5G phone masts spreading the virus. Do you remember that? The stuff that people... And what's mad about the people who believed that, it's none of us really found the right way to talk them down. We never really got our heads around how to talk them down. And I make no bones about the fact, I think that an awful lot of the support for people like Donald Trump and J.D. Vance is a consequence of exactly the same thing. You can believe that about 5G phone masts, then you can believe that about Sadiq Khan or about the United Kingdom or about London. And that's not mad online baiting. You know, the phrase Londonistan, I think was coined by Melanie Phillips, who still writes a column in the Times. These people believe the stuff that they pump out. And therefore, when it gets embellished and exaggerated and magnified and manipulated and lands in the inbox of a 75-year-old man in Florida, he is going to believe it too. And I don't know how you talk them down. But what we haven't seen before, and this is why I find J.D. Vance so interesting, what we haven't seen before is that boiled brain achieve. Well, we've seen it a bit in this country, probably with Liz Truss, probably with Andrew Bridgen. You remember him? Possibly with Nadine Dorries. We've seen some evidence of boiled brain syndrome in British politics, but to see it at and I don't think Trump has a boiled brain. This is why I find Chris Hayes' words so interesting. He talks about an ideological transformation and separates the opportunism from the self-radicalization. I think he, writes Chris Hayes, and huge swathes of the modern right really have self-radicalized, largely online, and are constantly imbibing all kinds of genuinely monstrous, insane, and bizarre ideas, and have come to believe them. So J.D. Vance then becomes someone who isn't spewing bilge to a loving audience. He is sharing his boiled brain convictions about what the United Kingdom is like. That's how you end up in a place where you can be lectured by someone who's never visited your town on what your town is really like. And the reason why you can't admit it is because you're not allowed to say so. I guess it probably depends a little bit on how much time you spend online. So there are two questions here, but I think you can probably distill them down to one. If you set aside, if you both accept and set aside the opportunism, if you say, yes, there is clearly opportunism here and it's hard to separate where the opportunism begins and where the ideological transformation ends. How can one man in 8 years go from calling Donald Trump America's Hitler to becoming Donald Trump's vice presidential running mate? Just pause for a minute and think about that. In the space of 8 years, to go from calling him America's Hitler, which was quite an early move, actually. It was before he became president, J.D. Vance was sharing that opinion. And then, of course, it hardened up as a prediction, as a description, throughout his presidency, culminating in January the 6th, which is about as close to the fascist playbook as any leader of a Western liberal democracy has ever come, in countries that stayed Western liberal democracies, as opposed to ones that actually fell to that kind of ideology. So the support for his description increased during the course of Donald Trump's presidency, but J.D. Vance retreated so swiftly and so violently from his position, from the idea that Donald Trump was America's Hitler, his words, not mine, that he has now accepted the nomination to be his running mate. I mean, do you want to have a crack at explaining that? I don't know that you'll do a better job than Chris Hayes, but I'd love you to try. He writes, a big part of modern right-wing culture is the frisson of the illicit, the reading of this or that writer or account who are outré in whatever ways. You know, it's like a sort of sick thrill you get from reading fascism, or reading race IQ obsession, or reading Holocaust denial adjacency, or even sort of weird sexual fixations and pathologies, he writes. And a lot of them, Chris Hayes suggests, have simply pickled their brains. So how does it work? How do you go from considering Donald Trump to be America's Hitler to accepting his invitation to be his running mate in a presidential election? 0345 60 973. A couple of callers still waiting, I think, to talk about the first Islamist country with nukes comment that J.D. Vance made. If you're just joining us, you might be a little surprised to learn which country he was referring to when he deployed that rather strange language. He was referring to Britain. He was referring to the United Kingdom. And on the Hitler thing, good Lord, there's a phrase. On the Hitler thing, I guess you have to contemplate the possibility that he's gone from going, God, he's America's Hitler, to, yes, he's America's Hitler. You have to contemplate that possibility. The transformation has happened inside him, as opposed to in his perceptions of Trump, or indeed inside Trump. 11 after 11 is the time. Let's take a couple more calls on the first Islamist country with nukes front, and then we'll move on. Good grief, here's a phrase I never would have heard. And then we'll move on to the Hitler stuff. Before that, it is my annual duty to remind everybody just how talented David Dimbleby was, and always will be when it comes to describing the state opening of Parliament. I don't know who gets the gig now. Is it Clive? Is it Clive Myrie? Who gets the gig now on the BBC? But it doesn't matter. You don't need to know, because I am here to do it for you on LBC. And I can tell you that the King is approaching Parliament. There is a lot of gold, and there are a lot of horses. Some of the military personnel present are wearing what I must concede are my favourite hats. The kind of wizardy ones with the big horses' tails coming out of the top of them. Some of the horses' tails are red, and some of the horses' tails are gold, which is quite appropriate, because the uniforms worn by, I believe they're horse guards, are both red and gold. The King, of course, when he reaches Parliament, will be delivering the King's Speech, which will contain the legislative programme for Sir Keir Starmer's new Labour government. There are some cannons being fired on my television screen, but not currently on my live audio feed, so there is something of a delay there, or perhaps the microphone is not close enough to the cannon. These are the great mysteries of these moments. You will recall, perhaps, that when the King arrives at the Palace of Westminster, he will make his way up the Sovereign's staircase. I could insert something made up here, couldn't I? And I'd get you afterwards. So which bit did I make up? Was it the Sovereign's staircase? Was it the red and gold kind of... Was it the cannons? Because you didn't hear them. You should trust the evidence of your eyes and ears. And then the King's Speech will begin. And now they make their way into Parliament. Blackrod is there. Lord McFall, the Lord Speaker. My producer has written on my screen, we should talk to LBC's political editor, Natasha Clark, shortly before the King's Speech begins, because she actually knows what she's talking about. What are you trying to suggest? This is outrageous. I'm Dimbleby Mark II on days like today. It's coming up to 11:15. Do we take a break and then return, do you think, to the pageantry? It is oddly powerful, isn't it? It is oddly moving to see this stuff, and the historic context in which it unfolds is, I think, unique. You know, nobody does this stuff better than we do. But at the same time, there is an element of absurdity to some of it. So Sovereign Staircase, robing room, it all goes a little bit Hogwarts, doesn't it, on occasion? But nonetheless, I think you do sort of feel a weird little patriotic bump. It is 11:15. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. 11:15 is the time. Thank you for your kind words. This is my favourite from David. He writes, David Dumbleby more like. I'll take that. I think you're absolutely right. It is J.D. Vance, however, about whom we are talking. And listen, I know we live in extraordinary times, but to go in 8 years from calling someone America's Hitler to saying, yeah, I'd love to be your vice presidential running mate, is off the charts crazy. If this had happened in the period prior to 2015, which I sort of fondly think of as an era of relative normality, although the cold fingers of austerity were already knocking at the door of our social security, you wouldn't credit it. Imagine if George W. Bush appointed a running mate who 8 years previously had called him America's Hitler. It just couldn't happen. Bill Clinton had appointed a running mate. Barack Obama had appointed a running mate. George Bush Sr. had appointed a running mate who 8 years previously had compared them honestly and sincerely and with evidence, compared them to Hitler. It's mad. It's a crazy journey. Kush is in London Bridge. Kush, what's going on?
All right, James, how's it going?
Very well, mate.
I haven't spoken to you since 2005 or something like that.
Well, why not?
I've finally got time to listen to the vote. I've never always been stuck in offices, and today I get to work from home.
There you go.
Whereas before I was a rep. But no, it's good to
WFH.
It doesn't mean I have not been listening to you, mate.
Well, so, I'm very glad to hear it. Welcome back. It's lovely to hear your voice. What do you want to say?
And I'm glad. So basically, I think this J.D. Vance, no one should be surprised. I mean, he has simply seen an opportunity for power and prestige in the same way as, do you remember when Boris Johnson was a Remainer?
Yes.
And then overnight came out as a Leaver, and he saw his pathway to power. Everyone knew he was a liar, but no one really thought about it until he actually got to power and then messed it up. And the same's going to happen here. If the Republicans win, which they're likely to, then essentially what's happened in America is they had a pause of stupidity when they elected Biden. Then they didn't realize how bad things could have got, like we did here, and thought Trump's a good idea again. And then things have changed and people have seen opportunity. It's about self-serving government over there. I was talking to a friend of mine who knows a congressman over in the US, and, they talk about the wall. They talk about the wall and building it and all that kind of stuff. Well, actually, did you know that Congress has been paralyzed over the last few months with blocking largely bipartisan agreement on actually building that wall? And what they mean is increased border security, etc. Yes. And it's been knocked back every single time so that it can become a political football for this.
I'd read something about that because so they can keep it as a hot potato, as it were. So I think at 10 o'clock this morning, I probably would have agreed with you about the opportunism, about it being 100% pure opportunism. But we can hold two thoughts in our head at the same time. And just because someone has made a ton of money as a tech entrepreneur and written a very successful book about the sort of dispossessed Rust Belt of America, it's a part memoir and part political analysis, the book Hillbilly Elegy, which lumped Vance and Trump in together as people who spoke for and about the dispossessed or the diminished working class of America, although at the time Vance passionately disagreed with everything Trump was doing under that umbrella. I would have agreed with you, but it's possible his brain has been boiled as well. There'll be people there, people sitting down next to Nigel Farage and Liz Truss at this Republican National Convention, and they'll be saying, is it true that London is living under Sharia law? And I don't know what those two would say in response, but it may not matter. They may actually believe it, and Vance may believe it. Just because he's clever doesn't mean he's... Yeah, go on.
Who believe it, who think that. And I'm like, no, it doesn't. And then when they come and visit us, my partner's American, by the way.
Right.
When they come and visit us in London Bridge, and we're out going for a drink on the side of the road, doing anything we want to do without any form of Sharia law anywhere, it's only the people outside of London that really believe it. And that's because they don't see it.
Yes.
And it's an easy place because it's a powerful city, it's an influential city, and it's easy to scare people by what's happening in London to your own ends. It's simple. It's just a power game. And to be fair, I think J.D. Vance is an extremely smart guy. And by the way, he can't be a racist. He's got an Indian wife.
I know. It's
you know that he's not a racist. He can't. But he's choosing opportunism, and he's going to be rich from it.
Well, I mean, he's rich enough already, but I think some of the people supporting him are presumably poised or doing so because they think that they will be able to make even more money. Elon Musk is donating about £35 million a month, I read, to Donald Trump's campaign. This is, of course, the guy who bought Twitter so that he could make it unbiased. And Peter Thiel, I don't know if I pronounced that correctly, is a deeply interesting individual who's said some extraordinary things about the role that the government should or should not play in the field of things like workers' rights and self-enrichment. But I don't know that I agree. I mean, it can be both, but I think there might be more brain boiling at play here than there, or at least as much brain boiling as there is opportunism. You start off thinking these people are opportunists, and then you read some of the stuff that they write, and you think, no, they really mean it. Someone's really hurt them at some point in the past. What has happened to these people? And then, of course, it gets sucked up. Kush, great stuff. Nice to have you back on board. 21 minutes after 11 is the time. Brian is in Glasgow. Brian, what would you like to say?
Oh, hi, James.
Hello,
thanks for having me on.
You're very welcome.
I think Vance is only doing what earlier congressmen have done. So Cruz, Rubio, they all did 180s as well.
That's true. But he wasn't a politician then. So they kind of thought we'll speak out against him because he's not going to win. And they were probably telling the truth then. But their careers depended on staying there. His career has only just started, so it's not quite the same.
Yeah, well, if you think about it, Cruz was told that if he didn't do a 180 on Trump, he would be not nominated for his state. They would put someone up against him, more MAGA inclined. And Cruz, I think he was told the same thing. Not Cruz, the other one, Rubio, was told the same thing in Florida, that if you don't embrace Trump and MAGA, we'll just put someone up against you. They'll get the nomination, and your political career will be over. But
that doesn't apply to Vance. None of that applies to Vance. He's signed up for it.
Yeah, what I was just going to say is because of his earlier history where he actually, as you quite rightly pointed out, where he denigrated Trump, and rightly so, sort of thing. He, again, knew that if he didn't turn, he would not get the nomination. I think it's West Virginia he is.
Yes, that's right. He wouldn't have got anywhere without Trump's endorsement.
Exactly. So this 180 is pure opportunism, as you say. But I think for me is that where they'll suspend their moral compass to do that 180 and then embrace a lot of this MAGA culture, for me is I think terrible for a politician.
Well, but of course it is. But we're never going to know. Is it 52-48? How much is opportunism, and how much is the likelihood that his brain has been boiled in the same way that and that's why Emma's point right at the beginning about the difference between the ones that Donald Trump is appealing to, who we could sort of see as good old boys, and the ones that Vance is appealing to, which is more the donor class, despite the fact that they both started off speaking for and about the Rust Belt. Vance with a lot more personal experience and qualification than Trump, but now he's more Elon Musk's boy than he is hillbilly elegy boy. I don't know, but I mean, crikey, I don't know whether to be grateful or heartbroken that they're going to be giving us so much material to talk about in the coming months. It is time now for me to return to the events in Parliament where King Charles will shortly deliver the speech setting out the legislative agenda for Sir Keir Starmer's first government. What are we expecting, Natasha Clark?
Morning, James. Yes, we are seeing on our screens right now what is called the...
I can do that.
Okay.
What are we expecting?
What, the King's speech?
Yes.
Okay, I can read out a list if you want.
What are going to be the big headlines? What are we expecting to be?
I think the most controversial thing today is going to be talking about planning reform, right? It's housing, building more homes. They're going to be taking away some of the powers from local people to object because the government has been really clear that we need to build more homes, we need to build more infrastructure, things to like more electricity pylons to carry green energy around the country. And like I say, it's mainly just about housing. So I think that's going to be something really controversial for a lot of people, a lot of MPs that clearly haven't.
It's not controversial until it's actually happening on your patch, is it?
But it's going to be all over the country.
Green MP has done.
Yeah, exactly. Saying that the Greens deputy leader saying that they're not going to support electricity pylon in their local area,
which are needed for green energy,
which is needed for green energy to take it up and down the country,
because
and they're not
going
to support it.
Constituency MP first.
Exactly, but I don't think that's going to last for long because according to what we're seeing for the briefings into the papers today, the government are going to have the powers to build that infrastructure. They're going to have the power to override councils, override local authorities. It's going to be quite controversial, I think, when it happens. And I think a lot is going to upset a lot of people when it happens.
And railways?
They're going to nationalise the railways. Great British Railways is going to be set up. It's going to be, obviously it's not going to nationalise every single part of it. I think the railways themselves, I think it's the actual railway carriages will not be nationalised.
The rolling stock. Yeah.
The rolling stock will not be, but it will basically mean that the default for these companies will be to take them into public ownership. The government claims it's going to save a lot of money. Whether that will happen or not, obviously the proof will be in the pudding. It doesn't specifically say anything about lowering our fares or anything like that, but it's all about digitising, making it easier to get refunds, automatic digitalisation of season tickets, things like that. So those will be some things that I think people will see as soon as these new bodies are set up. It's the kind of thing that, people, the kind of things that actually do affect people's lives and people will actually see our actual change on their doorstep, I think, as soon as they do start implementing.
As you rightly remind us, time will tell whether they achieve what they aim to achieve, but these are big, substantive policy decisions. They're not sort of tweaks and tinkerings or a million miles away from pronouncements that sounded a lot like culture wars, which we've heard in some recent King's speeches or even Queen's speeches. So we will wait and see. Do you want to have a go?
I was going to carry on with the legislative agenda. It's more my safe topic.
What else are we expecting to see?
Well, just important to point out, James, that we are expecting 35 bills. That's mammoth. That's huge from a government. I think Rishi Sunak's last one, and actually this is only the King's second King's speech, which we saw last year.
I'm glad you said that. I couldn't remember.
It is.
I nearly said first, and then I thought, no, it's third.
No.
Fourth, third,
I think it's
second.
the second. I believe it's the second.
We'll soon know if it isn't. Trust me.
We'll soon know. 35 bills, quite a lot going into that first legislative packed agenda. Keir Starmer, obviously the threads that we're going to see running through it, growth, I think is going to be the main one. You've seen those with some of the things that have been briefed out. We're going to see this national wealth fund created. We're going to see this sort of anti-Liz Trussifying of the economy. So a bill being brought forward we expect to see, which will essentially give more powers to the OBR to make sure that they are scrutinising absolutely everything that's going through in the economy. It's a little bit, I think, going to be a little bit lighter. I'm interested to see them with the details on exactly how they're going to get this growth that they magically say is untapped in the economy.
Be a big part of it.
Yeah, definitely. Planning
jobs,
will, I'm sure, be a part of it.
Big property companies historically like to drip feed houses onto the market to maximise profits and returns. So that again, may end up looking a little bit naive and idealistic when it's in the rearview mirror. But we will find out. You can hear in the background the King making his way. Do we call it a throne?
He will have his own special throne, yes.
It is a throne.
Towards his own special throne. I don't think he's yet taken his position.
He is yet to take his position in his throne, but he is wearing his crown.
He's got his own separate door as well in the House of Lords, which only he can
What's
use.
it called?
I don't know.
Because I know there's a sovereign staircase.
It might be the sovereign's entrance to the House of Lords. That would be what I would.
Steady on.
That'd be what I would guess.
There's definitely a robing room, and
Exactly,
he
we've
is.
had that.
I can confirm he is now wearing his robes, and he has at least 4 little robe carriers trailing behind him, like sort of a bit like bridesmaids at a wedding, but obviously with robes, not with wedding dresses.
It's not the same.
In their hands, making his way now up the royal stairs to the royal chair.
There he is.
Wearing the royal hat.
Very good.
And I suspect he's about to start speaking. Suspect stroke hope. He's about to start speaking. Think, expect. The monarch's throne, the BBC are reporting, is slightly higher than the Queen's, indicating his ascendancy, or if you were feeling mischievous, perhaps indicating
My
his...
lords, pray be seated.
And the speech will begin imminently. Now everyone has successfully sat down. Black Rod making her way into the house. From the Commons to the Lords, of course. The doors of the Commons will be slammed in her face by the doorkeepers. A demonstration of the independence of the House of Commons, independence of the King. So here, the doors open. She will now step into
Mr. Speaker, the King commands this honourable House to attend His Majesty immediately in the House of Peers.
So they now all make their way to the Lords, don't they? They all now pile into the House of Lords. Speech is a long way off. I don't know what on earth gave you the impression that he was about to start delivering it.
It was you, James.
What? Are you not supposed to say that out loud?
But yes, you're right. So now all of the MPs, and we'll see Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak as well, walking awkwardly side by side for the first time.
It's not always awkwardly, is it? It's always quite interesting to watch.
Oh, they're smiling, actually.
Yes, exactly.
Sharing a joke.
Sunak looks about four tons lighter over his shoulders than he did a fortnight ago, doesn't he?
So yes, they're all making their way to the House of Lords. Not all of those 650 MPs will be lucky enough to fit in. The senior you are, the more likely you're going to get a spot. And yes, they'll make their way into the House of Lords to hear the King deliver his speech. And we're now seeing them all pile in. So yes, not for a couple of...
Mother and father of the House. Is that Edward Lee with Diane Abbott? Was it?
I believe Edward Lee is still the father of the House. Yes,
God.
He's still the longest serving.
And of course, I'm often critical of him, but a very proud moment for Nigel Farage, who's waited a very, very long time to be in the House of Commons. And of course, his constituents in Clacton will be very, very proud to see him in attendance at the King's speech.
I'm sure they will. And his other
except he's in America.
Damn, we'll have to be represented by Lee Anderson instead.
Oh yes.
A shame,
isn't it?
But yes, we're seeing at the moment. They sort of tend to go into their pairs and their opposite numbers. You're seeing James Cleverly, now the shadow Home Secretary, and Yvette Cooper, now the Home Secretary. How the tides have turned, the tables have turned, and now walking, chatting to each other as they make their way. It's the closest I
get to. I like this. I think it reminds us of their humanity, and certainly in recent years, it's something that has occasionally been rather. Oh, Nigel Farage is there. He's not in America. He just walked past. So
I thought he was going to be by Trump's side immediately. No, is that him? That's him there in the blue.
I did as well, yeah.
His blue suit is pretty. God,
who's his suit? Who's that pale blue? Someone's wearing powder blue. That's beautiful. And now they sort of start piling into the House of Lords.
Yep, as you can see, there's just not much room in the back there. If you're not in
very
there,
few of them are going to get in, actually.
Well, Keir Starmer's going to change this, we hear, isn't he?
Well, there's going to be more room because there'll be fewer lords.
Exactly.
What else is on the agenda? What else are we likely to hear from the King shortly? Very shortly.
I think one of the main things the government wants to talk about today, and we'll be hearing more from the Transport Secretary later today, is about that nationalising of the railways. We're going to be hearing about Great British Energy too. That's going to be one of the things that the government have said they will put forward first in their legislative agenda. They're not going to be able to get all of these 35 bills, I'm sure, done in the first year, but it's a very ambitious start. We do expect there to be a lot in there. No surprises with what I was told by a Downing Street source earlier this week. It's all going to be stuff that's in the manifesto. Okay. It's all just going to be strong and stable, I think, is very much the buzzword of this government at the moment. They just want to keep it.
Went well last time.
It did go very well last time.
Michael's enjoying this, Natasha. He writes, it's like listening to a really bad drama class doing a scene from Game of Thrones.
Love that. I'll take that.
My
People
Lords
train.
and members of the House of Commons, my government will govern in service to the country. My government's legislative programme will be mission-led and based upon the principles of security, fairness and opportunity for all. Stability will be the cornerstone of my government's economic policy, and every decision will be consistent with its fiscal rules. It will legislate to ensure that all significant tax and spending changes are subject to an independent assessment by the Office for Budget Responsibility. Bills will be brought forward to strengthen audit and corporate governance alongside pension investment. Securing economic growth will be a fundamental mission. My government will seek a new partnership with both business and working people and help the country move on from the recent cost of living challenges by prioritising wealth creation for all communities. My ministers will establish an industrial strategy council. It is my government's objective to see rising living standards in all nations and regions in the United Kingdom. My ministers will get Britain building, including through planning reform, as they seek to accelerate the delivery of high-quality infrastructure and housing. They will also pursue sustainable growth by encouraging investment in industry, skills, and new technologies. My government is committed to making work pay and will legislate to introduce a new deal for working people to ban exploitative practices and enhance employment rights. It will seek to establish the appropriate legislation to place requirements on those working to develop the most powerful artificial intelligence models. My government believes that greater devolution of decision-making is at the heart of a modern dynamic economy and is a key driver of economic growth, and my ministers will introduce an English devolution bill. Legislation will be introduced to give new powers to metro mayors and combined authorities. This will support local growth plans that bring economic benefit to communities. A bill will be introduced to allow local leaders to take control of their local bus services. My ministers will bring forward legislation to improve the railways by reforming rail franchising, establishing Great British Railways, and bringing train operators into public ownership. Taken together, these policies will enhance Britain's position as a leading industrial nation and enable the country to take advantage of new opportunities that can promote growth and wealth creation. My government recognises the urgency of the global climate challenge and the new job opportunities that can come from leading the development of the technologies of the future. It is committed to a clean energy transition which will lower energy bills for consumers over time. A bill will be introduced to set up Great British Energy, a publicly owned clean power company headquartered in Scotland, which will help accelerate investment in renewable energy such as offshore wind. Legislation will be brought forward to help the country achieve energy independence and unlock investment in energy infrastructure. A bill will be introduced to support sustainable aviation fuel production. My government recognises the need to improve water quality, and a bill will be introduced to strengthen the powers of the water regulator. My government will seek to strengthen the border and make streets safer. A bill will be introduced to modernise the asylum and immigration system, establishing a new border security command and delivering enhanced counter-terror powers to tackle organised immigration crime. Legislation will be brought forward to strengthen community policing, give the police greater powers to deal with antisocial behaviour, and strengthen support for victims. Measures will be introduced to improve the safety and security of public venues and help keep the British public safe from terrorism. My government will bring forward plans to halve violence against women and girls. My ministers will seek to raise educational standards and break down barriers to opportunity. Action will be taken to get people back in employment following the impact of the pandemic. A bill will be introduced to raise standards in education and promote children's well-being. Measures will be brought forward to remove the exemption from value-added tax for private school fees, which will enable the funding of 6,500 new teachers. My government will establish Skills England, which will have a new partnership with employers at its heart, and my ministers will reform the apprenticeship levy. Legislation will be introduced to give greater rights and protections to people renting their homes, including ending no-fault evictions and reforming grounds for possession. Draft legislation will be published on leasehold and commonhold reform. A bill will be introduced to establish an independent football regulator to ensure greater sustainability in the game and strengthen protections for fans. My government will improve the National Health Service as a service for all, providing care on the basis of need, regardless of the ability to pay. It will seek to reduce the waiting times, focus on prevention, and improve mental health provision for young people. It will ensure mental health is given the same attention and focus as physical health. My ministers will legislate to modernise the Mental Health Act so it is fit for the 21st century. A bill will be introduced to progressively increase the age at which people can buy cigarettes and impose limits on the sale and marketing of vapes. My ministers will also legislate to restrict advertising of junk food to children, along with the sale of high caffeine energy drinks to children. A draft bill will be brought forward to ban conversion practices. My government will take steps to help rebuild trust and foster respect. Legislation will be brought forward to introduce a duty of candour for public servants. A bill will be introduced to establish a statutory Armed Forces Commissioner to act as a strong, independent champion for our gallant armed forces and their families. Legislation on race equality will be published in draft to enshrine the full right to equal pay in law. My government will strengthen its work with the devolved governments in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, so that the best outcomes possible are delivered for citizens across the United Kingdom. My ministers will establish a new Council of the Nations and Regions to renew opportunities for the Prime Minister, heads of devolved governments, and mayors of combined authorities to collaborate with each other. My government will continue to support the political institutions and devolved government in Northern Ireland. In consultation with all parties, measures will be brought forward to begin the process of repealing and replacing the Northern Ireland Troubles Legacy and Reconciliation Act 2023. Measures to modernise the Constitution will be introduced, including House of Lords reform, to remove the right of hereditary peers to sit and vote in the Lords. My ministers will strengthen the integrity of elections and encourage wide participation in the democratic process. The government will propose a modernisation committee of the House of Commons, which will be tasked with driving up standards, improving work practices, and reforming procedures. My government will ensure a strong defence based on the North Atlantic Treaty Organisation's common values of individual liberty, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. Its commitment to NATO will remain unshakable. It will maintain a strong armed forces, including the nuclear deterrent. To ensure that the United Kingdom's defence capabilities are matched to the changing nature of global strategic threats, my government will conduct a strategic defence review. My government will continue to give its full support to Ukraine and its people, and it will endeavour to play a leading role in providing Ukraine with a clear path to NATO membership. My government will seek to reset the relationship with European partners and work to improve the United Kingdom's trade and investment relationship with the European Union. My ministers will seek a new security pact to strengthen cooperation on the mutual threats faced by the United Kingdom and the European Union. My government will play its part in trying to secure long-term peace and security in the Middle East. It is committed to a two-state solution with a safe and secure Israel alongside a viable and sovereign Palestinian state. Later this week, my government will host the European Political Community meeting at Blenheim Palace. The Queen and I look forward to our visit to Samoa alongside the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in October and our visit to Australia. Members of the House of Commons, estimates for the public services will be laid before you. My Lords and members of the House of Commons, other measures will be laid before you. I pray that the blessing of Almighty God may rest upon your councils.
It is 11:48. You have been listening to King Charles deliver the legislative programme for Sir Keir Starmer's government in the House of Lords with the members, or at least as many members of the House of Commons as could be accommodated in attendance. He will now return the speech to the Lord Chancellor, who bends the knee before the throne, and the ceremonial and constitutional side of the proceedings is more or less complete. We will return shortly to pick over the political and substantive content of what we have just listened to. 10 minutes to 12 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. We knew exactly what was going to be in it, didn't we? And there, as you told us in advance, Natasha Clark, there were no surprises, no rabbits pulled out of hats. And yet still, I think it's fair to say, pretty substantive. King Charles now making his way out of the House of Lords, and some of the analysis will begin. Growth, with questions still remaining, quite a lot of questions, or at least one very big question about where precisely the growth is going to come from.
And looking at this, it does seem very clear that the only thing that really seems like it's going to create that growth is these changes to the planning laws, to housing, to being able to build more infrastructure in places that we really need it. That's the only thing that I can see in this plan.
I suppose the
English
devolution bill as well, that would a bit in the
potentially, but I think it's hard to gauge the success of that growth when we just don't know what the people who are in charge of the metro mayors, council leaders, we don't know what their priority is going to be. Or B, James, if they're going to even have the money to actually do the things that they're going to get the powers to do. We know local councils are already cash-strapped anyway. So whether they're going to be able to afford to do any of the things that might create the growth is another question. A few things that we weren't expecting. The ban on conversion therapy. I think it was mooted in a paper, I think, a couple of days ago that was potentially going to be brought back. That's going to be confirmed.
Supposed to have been in the last two monarch speeches, that, and then mysteriously wasn't.
Yeah, there was a big row about it last time, but that's now being brought back. They're quite keen to say it will not cover psychological support, treatment and counselling, which is exactly the whole row that Kemi Badenoch had in government about whether conversion therapy might work or not. So we are now confirming that's going to be back.
This is teaching people to have different sexual feelings. People teach conversional therapy in the context of sexuality and gender, or just sexuality?
I think it's both sexuality and gender.
So the idea that you get sent to a camp where you'll be trained out of whatever position you were in when you arrived.
Exactly. And I think, that's long been something that politicians want to crack down on. Everybody agrees across the board that these practices are wrong, but what they don't want in terms of any new laws to capture is counselling services, experts, the people that might be on hand to help
you come to terms
with what's going on, feelings around it, and obviously the psychological support and help that obviously everybody understands is necessary, but there are real fears that they may get caught up in some form of this legislation. So that's going to be brought back. I think that will please quite a lot of people, but for the government it's another headache down the line. This is something that the last government just thought, we just don't know how to navigate this.
It's too tricky. Well, again, it's they're grasping the nettle. The appetite for getting things done or getting on with things always opens the door to the possibility of things going wrong. The only way you can ensure that nothing goes wrong is by doing nothing, and even then it's not guaranteed. The House of Lords, you mentioned very cleverly that the problem of overcrowding may be solved shortly by House of Lords reform. That was there. He will remove the right of hereditary peers to sit and vote in the Lords.
Yes. There's no note of that peers' retirement age in that specific bit of the King's speech, but we are expecting that at some point to happen. He's also going to put a retirement age of 80 on. It's hinted that will be the first step in reforming the House of Lords. But yes, the first step, they're saying, removing the right for those hereditary peers to sit in the House of Lords to try and cut down the numbers. Keir Starmer said last week when we were on the way to NATO that he thinks that only the Chinese have a bigger upper chamber than we do.
Really?
Yes, he sort of laughed as he said it. So he's very keen to continue with that. Another thing not in it, votes at 16. We were widely expecting this to be in the King's speech. Various other journalists as well had also noted that they expected this to be in the King's speech. Clearly, Keir Starmer is trying to focus on that growth.
Well, he said something about extending democratic engagement.
He did. He said, my ministers will strengthen the integrity of elections and encourage wide participation in the democratic process.
Oh, no, that doesn't
quite
claim that was smuggling in votes for 16-year-olds.
It feels like that would be the natural place to put it if you were going to do it, but it's not noted at all. So I'm sure there will be some people who will be upset that that's not included, but equally, this government will carry on for 5 years. They've got to leave something for years 2, 3 and 4. Is that right?
Tell us more about what this new duty of candour for public servants is all about.
So it's a so-called Hillsborough law. Yes. So, the Labour Party rather have been promising this for years. Essentially, they want to put a duty on public servants to take part in things like public inquiries, to force them to attend. It will also, they say, help improve transparency and accountability. They also mentioned the infected blood inquiry as well as the Hillsborough case. So just trying to essentially strengthen public safeguards to make sure that there is a duty of candour for them, a legal duty on public servants and authorities to report wrongdoing, to take part in any inquiries, and to make sure things like this just do not get covered up ever again.
And so it will involve consequences.
Sorry, what will it will involve consequences
if you give if it is concluded that you knowingly gave false information.
I don't think that's not something that's specifically mentioned in this.
Right.
It's not something specifically mentioned in the King's Speech legislation. I just think it will give them new powers, and it will give inquiries potentially new powers to call forward the witnesses to give evidence. But I don't think there's an element of punishment if you do not take part.
Ukraine support remains in place, and we wondered, didn't we, whether or not the statement of a commitment to an independent sovereign Palestinian state marked a departure from previous speeches. But actually, the Queen said almost exactly the same words in 2010, delivering David Cameron's legislative agenda.
It's not something that usually gets mentioned, especially, like I say, 14 years since we've mentioned that in a King's speech. So the King said the government is committed to a two-state solution with a safe and secure Israel alongside a viable and sovereign Palestinian state. So no word of any sort of peace process, no word of any recognition of a Palestinian state, but obviously still committed. Like I say, that was the last government's position as well, a two-state solution. But writing it in the King's speech, I think, will be a bit of a step forward, a bit of a moment for some people. And
detail, as you say, lacking on the big issue of housing. Some reports already that housing companies or property firms, the housing sector, wondering how they're going to deliver 1.5 million extra houses in this Parliament alone, plus more social and affordable homes. I don't know how much detail they could have delivered on today, but they could certainly have delivered a little more than they have, is the early response of the housing sector itself.
I think that's fair. Like, reading this planning and infrastructure bill, it's very light on the detail. It's talking about reforming compulsory purchase compensation rules so that compensation is paid to landowners. It's talking about streamlining the delivery process so that these critical infrastructure can be built, so that more homes can be built. Talks about increasing local planning authorities' capacity, improving decision making, but it's all very wishy-washy and vague about exactly how they're going to create all of these new homes. And also, it just does create a lot more problems as well. We were talking earlier about the idea of capacity in terms of the labour workforce. We had a caller on this morning talking about how they just don't think there's the builders enough in the country to build all these new homes either.
The plural of anecdote is not data, but certainly in West London at the moment, good builders are as rare as hen's teeth. I don't know where you're going to find enough to build 1.5 million new homes. No shortage of detail on the VAT for private school fees policy. That's toast. The exemption from VAT for private school fees will shortly be history.
Yes, indeed. And obviously this is important because it's going to pay for all the things that Labour say they want to introduce that actually cost money, things like the breakfast schools and various other policies that Labour have promised. They've got to find some way to raise that money, and VAT on private schools is going to come forward. That is confirmed. It will be in one of the upcoming finance bills, so we're unlikely to see it probably implemented anytime soon. It's not going to be immediate, which will probably give some slight relief to some people planning for the next year of their school education, but it will be at some point raking in a fair bit of money for the Treasury.
And as we discussed earlier, the nationalisation of railways, Great British Railways will be the names. It's going for a lot of Great British.
They love it. Great British Energy.
Bake Off has a lot to answer for, doesn't it? It's now influencing the nomenclature of Keir Starmer's legislative programme. That will involve waiting for franchises to expire and then not allowing the private sector to...
And also making it the default as well for any potential new firms that come on the horizon or anything happens to them. They say that it'll save a lot of money. TBC, I think whether it will save taxpayers money, but they seem to think it will. And it brings back to the question of accountability. If the public are seeing all of these things being taken back into state ownership, they kind of want to see something for it. Otherwise, I think a lot of people will go, actually, what's the point in this?
It has to get better. If it gets better, that's all. And if they manage to hire 6,500 new teachers with the money raised by putting VAT on school fees, but people may feel the impact of that. Others may feel that it barely touches the side. What's the phone in here? What do you pick as the phone in out of all of the stuff that we've just seen?
Is this the most left-wing manifesto left-wing King's speech we've seen in a generation?
That's not a lot of left-wingism. Well, I suppose renationalisation.
Are you joking? Nationalisation, workers' rights,
it's a bit
abolishing
vague
hereditary peers.
I want detail. I want experience. I want evidence. I like the housing stuff. How feasible is it that they can build 1.5? I mean, literally, how feasible? If you can't get a plasterer right now, how do you respond to the news that Keir Starmer's going to build 1.5 million houses in 5 years.
Yep, and again, similar to what the Tories promised as well, but, we haven't hit our target for 300,000 homes a year for a long time, not since before COVID, I believe. Those housing targets not been met. But yes, I think the planning target will definitely be upsetting for some people to hear that they will lose their rights to complain.
It's a good job we didn't get rid of hundreds of thousands of skilled workers in the construction industry by abolishing freedom of movement. That would have been a really silly thing to do. It's 12:01. It's 5 minutes after 12, and it's a new era of British politics. A substantive, albeit light on detail, light on detail in some areas. I don't think it's fair to call it light on detail in other areas. The areas where it is lightest on detail can probably be best summarised as, where's the money going to come from? Where will the money come from? We're going to build 1.5 million houses. We know that Rachel Reeves has pledged £1 for every £3 provided by the private sector. Presumably the profits will be split similarly. And we also know that the housing sector depends upon a drip feed of properties into the public space in order to maximise house or home prices. So it is not a sector I know everything about, but I know enough about it, I think, to ask you the right questions. Bad news for NIMBYs, or at least for communities currently able to resist plans to build homes and infrastructure on areas that are currently not inhabited. Compulsory purchase orders will become a lot more commonplace, perhaps, than they currently are, and indeed payments to landowners for development sites under compulsory purchase orders must be, in the words of the King's Speech, fair but not excessive. It seems to me they're betting the house on the houses. Well, that's good. You can write that down. They're betting the house on housing. It is housing that will unlock our country's economic growth. It will create jobs. It will sort of churn up funding channels and deliver much needed new housing and wider development such as renewable energy projects. So it's planning and infrastructure that they are betting the house on. Some early responses of yours, largely positive. Lee writes, the adults are back in the room. Brilliant. Phil writes from Germany, don't underestimate the effect of banning no-fault evictions on the mental health of the most disadvantaged, James. This is a massive step forward and puts renters' rights level with most European countries. Janine's a little bit more sceptical. I live in Lancashire. My daughter's boyfriend is a builder and he doesn't have enough work. People don't have the money. But that's the point of government-funded building. Whether or not they've got the money to buy new homes is a slightly different question. So I think that's where we'll go. We used to talk about building all the time on this programme, would you believe? I'm going back a long way now, and it would generally involve, before I managed to turn around the oil tanker of talk radio in the United Kingdom, it would generally involve British builders ringing in to complain about how awful all the Eastern Europeans were, and they all slept 46 to a room and undercut them on their jobs. And anyway, even when they did the jobs, all the British builders had to then go in and fix the jobs because the jobs that had been done by the Eastern Europeans were so awful. And I'd sit here asking unhelpful questions like, well, what are you complaining about? If you have to go in and fix the work that they've done, then you've got work as well. And then you'd have some experiences that added to the idea of something a little bit unpleasant going on. For me, it always happened in Hammersmith. And you would see... people don't believe me when I tell them this, but I used to get a car to work in the mornings. So I used to see it. I wouldn't see it now because I come in either on public transport or on a bicycle. But there would be a gathering of workers on a street corner in Hammersmith. And the vans of builders would pull up and point at people and say, you can have a day's work, you can have a day's work. Like the old sort of pre-union days on the docks. And I remember being really stunned by it at the time, but people told me not to be because they'd actually be getting a decent scratch for doing that. And my thoughts inevitably went to the people who never got picked. What happens to them? They just have to go home? I don't know. But the point I'm making is that the world of construction in this country is utterly unrecognisable from the world of construction in this country when I started doing this for a living. It is utterly unrecognisable from the world of construction in this country before we left the European Union. There are so many areas in which I don't have the knowledge or the information that I need to comment intelligently on how plausible it is for us to build 1.5 million new homes over the course of the next Parliament. So who is qualified to answer that question? Well, anybody, really, in the world of planning, in the world of housing, in the world of recruitment, in the world of construction. I don't think it is particularly relevant that if you want to find a good plasterer, in my corner of the capital at the moment, the waiting list is as long as your arm, but it might be relevant. I mean, where will all the workers come from? And how would you feel? I don't know if we can do that question yet when we know a little bit more about the reality of what's been put in place. But are we going to have to issue more visas to construction workers, a sort of reverse Auf Wiedersehen Pet? Do you remember Auf Wiedersehen Pet? Rather splendid 1980s comedy featuring Jimmy Nail and Timothy Spall and others, in which British construction workers struggling to find gainful employment in this country were tempted to Germany, where growth was out of control and where building was happening on pretty much every Strasse in every city. And so if we are to build 1.5 million new homes in this country, where are the workers going to come from? That's question number one. 0345 6060 973. What is the state of play regarding recruitment in the construction industry? Where are the workers going to come from? Hit the numbers now. We will get through. On a broader basis, the question of whether or not you feel it is feasible. Remember that the Conservative Party had to abandon the £300,000 home pledge. Been in quite a lot of King's and Queen's speeches over the years, or been in quite a lot of Queen's speeches over the years. I think it was probably in the last King's speech, but maybe not actually. But anyway, Rishi Sunak abandoned the 300,000 homes a year pledge because they just weren't keeping it. It wasn't being met. If Labour reintroduced the pledge and failed to meet it, then I think they're going to have some fairly hefty questions to answer. And then I think back to helping my daughter with her A-level history revision and discovering just how many houses were built under the Tories beginning in 1951 when Winston Churchill became Prime Minister. And our workforce then would have been considerably smaller. So it is all doable. You have to presume, because you have got what's the word I'm looking for? You've got professional. You have got grown-ups in charge now. It doesn't mean they'll get it right. Grown-ups mess up as well, but they're not going to be wasting their time on culture wars and performative cruelty and internecine warfare. Crucially, I think Keir Starmer's pretty safe in his job for a few years yet. They're not all going to be queuing up in the background to seek to depose and replace him. So you've got a government that wants to get things done. No guarantees that they will get things done. But if they are to get things done, you have to hope that they've done their homework. Let's do it ourselves. Let's do our own homework now. 12 minutes after 12 is the time. 300,000 new homes a year. You will need to be an expert on the state of recruitment in the construction industry, the planning rules as they stand, the ease with which new homes can be thrown up, the tradition of housing companies to drip feed new properties onto the market in order to keep prices as high as they could possibly be, which is basic capitalism, and a left-wing government, a Labour government coming in and pledging or claiming to have solutions to all of those problems. So there's an awful lot of angles from which you can come at this question. And of course, crucial to all of this, as pointed out by David, house prices can never be allowed to go down. He says for some reason, and I would say because it's electoral kryptonite if the value of your property starts coming down as a consequence of government policy. So we need to build enough houses to stop house prices increasing. That's the only way houses can become more affordable relative to earnings. I think that's a really clever analysis. Build enough houses to stop the constant inflation of house prices, but not enough to actually bring it down. Let's get the phone lines open. The number you need is 0345 6060 973. You will most certainly... Oh, hang on. Good Lord. Yes, you've all... quite a few people asking what's happened to my anecdote about being a builder. I don't think it serves much purpose. The 2 weeks I spent in Doncaster in 1988 doing the only back-breaking work of my entire existence probably doesn't equip me with a great deal of insight into what may be on the agenda for the UK in the context of house building. But it is true that I am basically a builder first and a broadcaster second, at least chronologically. But I'm confident that you will know a lot more about this sector than I am. So just talk me through it. Where are we going to build the houses? Where are we going to get the builders from? Where's the money? We know roughly where the money's going to come from. You, as someone who follows this stuff quite closely, looks at this proposal and thinks, what? 0345 6060 973. 16 minutes after 12 is the time. I don't want to make it Brexity, but it has to play a part in the supply chain of materials, of course. That is now harder than it was before we left the European Union. And crucially, the free movement of labour. That's probably going to play a part as well. The idea that we're going to be able to build 300,000 new homes a year, new houses a year for the next 5 years is one that I feel a kind of English reaction to it already, even though I'm a lot more optimistic about the current government than I have been about the last few. I'm already being a bit of a misery guts. I'm already reaching for whatever the opposite of hopium is. I'm sort of, oh dear, I don't know about that. In some ways, I'd invite calls today from people who think, yep, this is perfectly doable and I'm here to tell you how. At least as much as we take calls from people who are sceptical or unconvinced. We want it to be true, don't we? Up until the point that we discover that they're building 2,000 new houses just outside our bedroom window, at which point you probably think they should be doing it somewhere else. So there's a lot to dive into. Let's start with Nathan, who's in Portsmouth. Nathan, what would you like to say?
So I was saying to your researcher, James, I've been working in the bathroom industry for 35 years. So that's on either refurbishment, as a wholesaler supplying to the retail shops who then supply either to the individual consumer or to the builders and developers.
Yeah, I get that.
So one of the biggest problems is that the average age of a builder now in the UK is 52.
Gosh, that's my age.
The average age of a builder, yeah, sure, I'm 55. I was on a site the other day in Stratford upon Avon, a beautiful building, and the three guys on the roof, all the other lads were calling them Dad's Army because they were 68, 69 and 70 years old.
Good Lord.
And they're roofers.
Yeah.
So my own son, coincidentally, he is 20 in September. He's just finished his carpentry and joinery apprenticeship. So he was saying that the real problem, which is evidenced by the fact that the average age of the builder is 52 or more.
People haven't gone into it.
They haven't gone into it in the first place. So in his class that he qualified about a year, 18 months ago, I think there were about 15 or 20 lads. 3 dropped out during the first year. Few others just went on to building stages for concerts, so it wasn't really in construction.
Okay.
So the apprenticeship thing, and I was saying to your researcher that many young people, and I don't want to sound flippant about young people, want to earn $100,000 a year being a YouTube influencer. And they
it's
don't
overrated.
realise...
I'm a massive YouTube influencer. It's overrated.
Well, the interesting thing is that actually in London now, again, I was at a site in Chelsea this time last week, the top-end carpenters, $500 a day are getting paid.
Will your boy be getting that? Will your boy be getting that then shortly?
Not shortly,
but when he's
I
got
hope
a bit
you won't
more...
mind me saying that he's on 165 a day.
Right.
And he's 19.
So that's 800. It's not bad, is it, really?
That's pretty strong. I mean, he travels an hour each day from Portsmouth to Guildford, where is the site he's on at the moment.
Okay.
That site will come to an end. There'll be another one, but it will still be a long journey. He has to get up at 6. He's on site for
and it's hard work, isn't it? I know what you mean when you refer to $100,000 a year to be a YouTube influencer. It's a mark of a successful economy that the people who've been brought up in it, rather than the people who have moved to it, are less likely to want to do physical work because it's tiring. And the other problem with the 52 average age is it hurts, Nathan. It hurts because I've got a couple of mates who are in the building trade, and both of them have gotten what I believe the technical term is they've both got knackered backs, and they're younger than me. They're in their mid-40s, and they can't move fridges anymore. There's jobs they can't do. You know what it's like. They couldn't get a bathtub up the stairs anymore, and they could have done 5 years. So you need a young workforce coming in.
You do, but you can earn seriously good money outside London as well. And I take the point about the lady that said that her daughter's boyfriend was a builder in Blackpool. He's got no work. Of course, there are pockets where people will be struggling to afford and can't do the loft conversion or the extension or refurb the kitchen or bathroom. But nevertheless,
there's a lot going on here. Is it? So we both want it to work because that is the inevitable patriotic position to adopt, particularly in the context of economic growth.
But you've got to have the youngsters coming through.
And they're not coming through. And they can't turn that tap of youngsters on tomorrow, can you?
Well, I suppose...
They need to build 300,000 houses this year.
Yes, that is a problem. But remember, you can qualify as a carpenter. The reason people like carpenters is if you are a plumber, you only want to see pipe work. If you're an electrician, you only want to talk about cable.
Yeah.
Whereas carpenters, you can do the roof trusses, you can do the built-in wardrobes, you can do the skirting board and the door frames.
Oh, okay.
They're a much more versatile trade. Now, a carpentry course you can do if you left school at 17, by 19 you're qualified. So from the government's point of view, in years...
So if Nathan is describing your son or daughter and they're kicking their heels a bit or at a bit of a loose end, then you know what
go and learn a trade.
You know what you should be signing them up to do. Nathan, that's a lovely start. Thank you. So cautious optimism with a healthy side order of detail, please. And I don't know how they'll do that. If we need more workers, then we are going to have to get them from somewhere, and they are unlikely to all be sort of queuing up at the end of the sixth form at the moment, waiting for a nice easy passage into the workforce. But then again, we allow ourselves to be perhaps unduly influenced by the xenophobic and racist rhetoric of the Farages and the rest of them. Maybe if it is presented to the British public as a necessary and welcome precursor to increased economic growth and more housing, everyone will be perfectly chilled about the fact that we are going to have to beg people that we told to clear off back to where they came from 8 years ago to move back here and help us build homes. I don't know. 03456060973 is a number you need if you think you do. I saw Tom Holland, the actor, who's currently playing Romeo, around the corner, and of course you probably know best as one of the Spider-Man stars. I saw him talking about his mum sending him on a carpentry course when he was a already successful actor, but as a sort of safety net in case the acting didn't work out. I don't know if you've seen the clip online anywhere, but it's really charming. It's really lovely. So it was all the other kids on the course came from quite troubled backgrounds. Some of them have been in youth offenders institutes, and he's been making Hollywood movies already. But I guess he was going through a quiet period when he was too young to play children and too old to play children and too young to play adults. So his mum sent him on this course, and he said they would all be chatting about their exploits and their adventures, and some of them were quite hair-raising. And I'd sit there, he said, and I'd say things like, well, I was on a film set once and my coffee was quite cold. It's a very charming lad, actually. 23 after 12 is the time. Georgia is in Poole. What do we think, Georgia?
Yeah, my partner's a bricklayer and work's been really, really slow. They let half of his workforce go, and it's a big building company.
Oh, that's scary.
They let half of them go recently, and they were told they had 4 years of work on one site, but then they stopped building because they weren't getting the prices they wanted for them. So that's a big part of the problem, is that building companies who are building the houses, which we are desperate for, like my partner's a builder, we can't afford to buy a house. We're private renting. It costs a fortune. If they put those houses on at shared ownership, they'd fly off. But the building companies are holding on too much to wanting
this is the thing.
Unaffordable prices.
Yeah, well, exactly. So
the work is, if the work was there are people who are desperate.
But are there enough?
Probably not enough to build 300,000
without a bit more immigration.
Yeah, but if that's going to get the economy moving and get people housed, so they've got secure living accommodation, then that can only be a good thing, and it's all about how it's framed.
Well, it was a very good thing before we abolished freedom of movement, but you're absolutely right. The framing was all wrong, wasn't it?
Crumbled as well.
Yes, it's remarkable.
It all just sort of fell apart.
But your partner's all right. He wasn't one of the ones that was laid off.
He is, only because he is young. He is younger.
Gets paid a bit less.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Okay.
he's not. It goes very much on experience.
But this is encouraging, isn't it? The idea that there is a workforce there, both trained and untrained, and
definitely
we can move the untrained to the trained.
Yeah, young people are keen to get into it. I feel like young people are so disenfranchised and feel like everything's been a bit pointless. And that's part of the reason why it might appear that they're not motivated to go into trades and these types of things, because they just don't see, there's like all the hope's just gone out of
Is that right?
young people. But if they had hope, if they thought, if I work hard, I can get a house and have a family, then I feel like they would be much more motivated.
They
and
I think I love what you're saying, Georgia, and actually you probably sound like, I'm sure that your words would be ringing in the ears in a good way of the Labour government, because that's precisely the kind of idea that they want to generate. The notion that this is not only going to generate economic growth, but it's also going to give purpose to people who perhaps lack it at the moment. And I have to be careful of not overdosing on hopium as a 52-year-old man, the average age for a builder, which proves your point precisely about the necessity of bringing younger people into the industry. Maybe we've forgotten what it's like to actually think, oh, this is important, this is substantive, this has got nothing to do with culture wars or race rhetoric, this is something good for the country. Can we all get our shoulders to the wheel and do it? Or maybe that is evidence of overdosing on hopium. It's 27 minutes after 12. Chris is in Liverpool. Chris, what would you like to say?
Hello, James.
Hello.
Nice to speak to you.
Likewise.
So, I mean, a couple of points, really. I've been working in the construction industry for just over 20 years now.
Okay.
10 years ago, we signed up to the Paris Agreement.
Yes.
In 2015 to reduce our carbon output. Now, the proposal to build on Greenbelt just shocks me, really. These are the lungs of our country. The building industry pumps out a lot of carbon. And
I mean, there was nothing specific in the speech today about the green belt being built on, was there? Or was there?
Well, I haven't seen anything factual. I've just heard that the Labour want to kind of have a look at the regulations and open up new areas for building.
Well, I mean, they want to They want to reform planning procedures to accelerate house building, but there's no particular plan, I don't think, to start throwing up housing on the green belt. I don't. I mean, I could well be wrong, but neither is this really an answer to the question of how feasible it is to build 300,000 houses a year.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, the way that the model is at the moment,
we've got about 8% of the country that's built on currently. I think is a rough estimate.
I kind of take it to the ultimate degree. I mean, are we going to rip up the planning regulations and become?
Well, no, we're not. I mean, okay, I mean, take it to the ultimate degree if you want, but Greenbelt's about 11% of the country. About 8% of it is built on. I think that leaves quite a lot. And it's not. I think you're mistaking what Greenbelt means. It doesn't actually mean green. I hesitate to lecture you because you're the one that works in the construction industry, but It's not a designation of the colour of the land. It's more a designation of the state of the planning laws in those areas. But I guess that's just wait and see pie, Chris, and sort of fingers crossed territory. 29. They'll build on some of what is currently called the green belt, but it doesn't mean they'll necessarily be chopping down trees or chopping down forests in order to do it. I think we both need a little bit more detail before we can draw any more meaningful conclusions in that very specific area. It's coming up to 12:30. Amelia Cox is here now with your headlines. There's a thing here from Brad, and maybe we need to move the conversation in this direction a bit as well, because I meant what I said before about hard work, physical labour. Generally, if you do physical labour, generally it's not what you want for your children, because of the physical toll that it takes. My two pals who work together both got absolutely knackered backs, and it's not funny. The work they do is now limited, and the hope is that they'll get better, but the nature of the work that they do makes getting better much harder because they're constantly engaged in serious physical exertion. When you're building houses, you are building them all year round. I'm not patronising anyone or being stupid. I'm reminding you that this conversation, if it were being conducted on a day where it was snowing outside, would feel a little bit different from how it feels on a day when it's not. So getting young people into the building trade is almost certainly a crucial part of this programme. Not least because even if there's enough there now to build 300,000 houses this year, a portion of them will be moving on, retiring or changing jobs. So you need to get this flow of talent, this flow of labour into the construction industry, and that means making the construction industry tempting. I don't think in the first instance you are going to be able to I don't think you're going to be able to get the workforce that's currently not working. You know, the numbers that we've been hearing an awful lot about. The people who are, for example, off long-term sick are probably not going to be the most obvious candidates for moving into the construction industry. But how do you make it attractive to young people? The answer is going to be money. It's going to be Nathan in Portsmouth telling us that a carpenter can be making 500 quid a day, and there's going to be an awful lot of people whose ears prick up at that point and think, crikey, that's a heck of a lot more than I'm currently making. But that's not immediately. That's much further down the line. But his boy's making 165 quid a day already as a very recently qualified carpenter. So how do we get young people into the construction sector? That's one question that's running this hour, 0345 60973. But the second, and I don't like it when my questions are a bit flabby, but sometimes I can't help it because we haven't got the laser yet that we need to get to the heart of this issue. But when I read that the housing sector is asking for the detail on how Labour will meet its promise to deliver 1.5 million extra houses in this Parliament, i.e. over 5 years, what would that detail look like? Do you see what I mean? What does a government, what can a government do? So on rail privatisation versus nationalisation, it's not hard to work out what renationalisation means. It means that when the the current franchises expire, the workforce moves on to the national books, but they become employees of Great British Rail. That's why the appointment of Peter Hendy to a ministry in the Department of Transport is quite exciting, because he is one of the public servants over the last few years, in London at least, under Boris Johnson and under Sadiq Khan, who has seemed to be at least very effective. So these people will be able to, we know what that would look like, but what would government policy look like if it were to describe the detail behind the desire to deliver 1.5 million new homes over the course of this Parliament? And that is a question or an entire thing that's impossible to contemplate without looking at where the workers are going to come from. Juan is in Welwyn Garden City. Juan, what would you like to say?
Oh, thank you for having me on, James.
Very welcome.
I've been working in the construction industry for just about 20 years now as a quantity surveyor. So I've worked on many projects doing housing for both high-end luxury and affordable housing.
Yes.
Part of the problem with the planning is that projects can be held up for years, 5 or more years, and this obviously affects the cash flow of the developers and the clients and the construction main contractors, which creates a famine and feast kind of industry. It's not like Europe, where they have constant construction and they can maintain a level of cash flow where people can afford to keep people on board. You know, it's a lot of the people are freelance, a lot of the traders are freelance and not in the book.
And the less reliable the work, the more likely you are to move out of the sector.
Absolutely. I mean, you have bills to pay. Your bills are always going to be the same month, more or less every month, but the work isn't. That's not the nature of the construction industry in the UK.
So you tell me then what the detail would look like in the context of making those planning delays or those delays caused by planning disputes disappear. What would that look like as a policy or as an idea?
As a policy, as an example, Hertfordshire Council goes into partnerships with the likes of Morgan Sindel to build £1 billion worth of affordable housing.
And when they decide where it's going to be built, and that's the end of it. Whereas at the moment, there'd be 5 years of wrangling over whether they were going to be able to go ahead or not. Is that what we're talking about?
Exactly.
Okay.
And that ensures that the main contractors are themselves viable, because there's a lot of talk about people not being available for work, but construction companies are very stressed. There's only some that are surviving. There's quite big companies that are going under.
Right.
And it's not just the traders, the professionals as well. People like me who have to work the detail, who have to do the cash flow to arrange for the finance, who have to make sure that these projects are viable. People like us haven't been trained, and that's because of the low margins that some of these contractors go in on, and the low prices that are being asked.
So you're presumably quite encouraged by what you've heard today.
Definitely.
And you're the closest to the kind of ground, as it were, of all our callers so far, because as a quantity surveyor, you're moving from development to development
yes,
all the
absolutely.
time.
And I've obviously got my finger on the pulse regarding costs, regarding availability of who can actually build the project, the quality of what they're being delivered. And I'm sorry to say it, but the quality of work out there is reflective of the constant chasing of low prices, and the low prices are required to pay for the finance costs that a lot of these projects incur in
the planning disputes.
Exactly, in the planning dispute, and the amount that gets spent in legal fees trying to work out what goes where and who has what right is it builds into the housing cost eventually. So if you can make that streamlined, it inevitably flows that it becomes cheaper to construct.
I get calls occasionally. So it's 20-1 now, and this has been a really interesting phone-in, and we've had good contributors, and the texts, as ever, are at least as informed and informative as the callers. But there's a level of understanding here that I didn't know I didn't have, and now I've got it. So why is planning so important? Why are they banging on about planning all the time? And you've explained that it does two things. It not only delays the building, but it increases the costs of the building if and when they are finally built. So addressing planning procedures by coming in fairly sledgehammer as opposed to scalpel and saying that's where we're building it, and councils no longer have the ability to fight developers or planning disputes are never going to happen. As long as we're confident we've got the workforce, this is actually pretty close to brilliant.
Time is money. The quicker you can
that's the bit I missed, man. That's the bit I missed. Makes perfect sense. I just thought it was all about, planning means that we're not building as much as we're building, but it also means that when we are building, we're building more expensively than we need to be.
Exactly. The same house is going to cost the same whether you argue about it or not.
Yeah.
Except you have to pay for the argument, which builds no value.
Yeah, if I can't give you a Ray Liotta because the country's full of quantity surveyors. But if I had another accolade that I reserved for callers of particular and special acuity, then you would be getting that award now, Juan.
James, I appreciate it, especially from someone like you. Greatly appreciate it.
There you go, a bromance, a budding bromance live on the radio. 12:41 is the time. So inevitably, someone else will come along now with a bucket of cold water or a bucket of ice and explain why Juan and I are wrong to be hopped up on hopium. But that's the bit I didn't understand. I only understood half of the relevance of planning regulations to this policy. So the government's promise is to, quote, get Britain building by reforming planning procedures to accelerate house building. Half of that is about being able to build houses more quickly because the planning disputes will not be permitted. And there's a downside to that if it's next door to you. But the other half of it is the costs of the planning disputes are baked into the cost of the new homes. So get rid of the planning disputes and everyone's a winner. 12:42 is the time. Frank's in Tameside. Frank, what would you like to say?
Good afternoon, James.
Hello.
Yeah, very interesting discussion.
I hope so.
I am part of, in that I own farmland within a scheme that is due to provide 2,150 homes in Tameside.
Gosh.
The comments that your quantity surveyor has just made are absolutely spot on.
Wow.
I was aware that the land that we own was likely to go for building as far back as 1966 when my dad walked away from it.
Good Lord.
This scheme has now been in the running for 10 years. It's Jonathan Reynolds' constituency, and of course we're within Andy Burnham's Greater Manchester county area. It's Jonathan Reynolds' bequest to the borough of Tameside as and when it goes through. As I say, it's been on the run for 10 years. It took 8 years for the council to submit a planning application while they wrangled through the detail.
What talk me about wrangling through the detail? What sorts of things were they wrangling about? Because I know all of the old cliches about greater crested newts and things like that, but that's not what you're talking about, I don't think.
Well, 340-odd PDFs in support of the planning application.
What's a PDF?
Considering every aspect of
You mean the
detail.
document? You mean a document?
Yes, yeah.
Right, just a
Some
PDF
of those
document.
PDFs were 350 pages each.
Good Lord. And what's in them, Frank? Forgive me for sounding stupid, but it's not an act. I really am on this, completely ignorant. What's in them? How can you have 8 years' worth of wrangling over a couple of thousand houses?
Every informed professional on God's earth gets roped in to submit a consultancy report on anything that you can consider. And I mean, at the end of the day, this was all predicated on the ability to access Hattersley railway station so that people could commute to Manchester.
Okay.
How many car parking spaces have they provided in the scheme at Hattersley railway station?
Well, some of it will be really important. I'm not an enemy of red tape because I think red tape, when you look at it from a different angle, is actual civilian protection and safety that protects all of us. But 8 years is absurd. And you
James, I'm with you. I want to see good, positive, forward-looking planning.
Yes,
but it gets lost in the detail. It gets lost.
I can buy this. So the word is sclerotic, I think I learnt quite recently. I'm not 100% sure what it means, but I think... So what did you make of what you heard today, or what you've heard in recent weeks about what the Labour Party is planning on doing?
Well, it's going to be interesting to see what happens. I mean, I was saying to your researcher that if you go back to 1975, Callaghan's government, Wilson's government, they introduced something called development land tax.
Right.
Which is somewhat similar to what you've heard about compulsory purchase today.
Okay, right.
Development land tax meant that a planning application had a dual role. It created a trigger for a compulsory purchase order, and the compensation under that compulsory purchase order was existing use value.
Okay.
So in other words, the development industry dried up. Now, it's interesting to hear comments that have been very quickly made today about compensation being reasonable. That suggests to me that the government are respecting the fact that industry needs to make a profit to keep going forward.
Okay.
I mean, let's be quite honest. Argument's sake, average value agricultural land, £5,000 per acre.
Okay.
Average value residential, $500,000 an acre. Which do you want to take?
Yeah, there's no real mystery there. What do you still farm the land while all of this is going on?
Well, we're trying to, but you can't invest. You can't. You can only maintain.
Well, you're not going to go out and buy
extent.
new equipment if you think that they're going to be building houses on it this time next year, and you hope that they are going to be building houses on it this time next year. But you're in the same position this time next year, hoping they're going to be building houses on it this time next year.
We've short-circuited the local authority. A group of us have put 950 houses into the hands of a residential builder.
Okay.
That builder is now talking to the council, and we are hopeful that possibly by the end of next year they will have agreed what they call a Section 106 commitment, which is basically the cost of doing the job with the public sector contribution, the amenity areas, all the rest of it. and that we can then move on. But like I say, I just hope I'm still alive by that time.
Frank, so do I, Frank.
I'm not joking.
I know
mean,
you're not.
Last autumn, I lost 10 of me mates, and it
dear.
hurts.
Oh, of course it does. I'm sorry to hear that, but I'm very glad you were listening today, because you've shone a sort of a shining light into the heart of these issues. And if I've understood what you've told me correctly, what the Labour Party seem to be proposing is a nationwide version of what you've done at a relatively small local level, except that it would be in conjunction with the local authority rather than almost in opposition to them, that these projects then went ahead on a bigger scale.
Well, I mean, the one thing that your previous caller, your quantity surveyor, mentioned was cost.
Yeah.
There is a lovely little trigger in this scheme in that the local authority owns 8 acres.
Right.
So they can effectively sell that to the private sector. That starts the finance wheel turning. Once there is money in circulation, away we go. This scheme supposedly has a 15-year life. You're talking about continuity in the construction industry. 15 years is going to keep a lot of guys in employment for a long time.
What a call. Have you never rung me before, have you, Frank?
Yeah, of course I have. I go to Kidderminster now and then.
I know you do. That's absolutely brilliant. I genuinely now can feel my understanding of the issue moving into an entirely new space. But I didn't know you had that level of, that depth of knowledge drawn entirely from personal experience, which is not always, but is often the best place to draw it from. 12:50. One is the time. There is a danger, Richard says, as a council planner, that we're overstating the costs of planning delays. Many published reports showing that really the Tory government just had no inclination to actually act on them, as more houses would mean lower values and angry grey-haired Tory voters and NIMBYs. So the big difference between Tory and Labour councils in delivery of housing just needs to become nationwide rather than council specific. If all permissions were built out, targets would have been met. So we need powers, better powers, says Richard, to force owners sitting on sites for decades to sell it to a developer who will actually build out. And now I understand why the phrase compulsory purchase has been reintroduced to this discussion today by the King's Speech, by the Labour Party's legislative programme. Frank in Tameside, desperate to build on his land and can't. Bloke over the road, sitting on it until the price goes ever higher. So government come in and deal with both of those. They say to Frank, right, we're not going to have 8 years of planning disputes. We're going to have a streamlined, efficient system that gets the ground broke. What's the phrase you use? Breaking the ground, which means we're breaking the ground much sooner rather than later. And to the bloke over the way, and this person, if you were coming at this from an anti-state or a libertarian point of view, this person would probably be a bit of a cause célèbre for you. Bloke over the way just is told, sorry, we're paying you the market rate for it and we're paying you now. And that is the end of it, whether you like it or not. And we know they can do that, and we know that it works because it's how they got HS2 built before they abandoned much of the project later. So we know what compulsory purchase is. We probably just needed a little bit of help understanding its relevance to this conversation. So we've got a sclerotic planning system caused partly by its nature and partly by its implementation. And the challenge for the Labour government is to fix that. And it doesn't mean they will. It just means we now understand what the plan is and what the likelihood of delivering on it hinges upon. 12:53 is the time. Sunny is in Milton Keynes. Sunny, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Thanks for having me on. I'm a Ugandan Asian refugee, grew up in the UK in the 70s, and I grew up in a council house. I became an architect, actually, because I met the architect who designed our council house.
Gosh, what a great story.
Yeah, he was picking up my sister's friend from a birthday party. So I've been in the industry many years. I currently work for a major UK contractor. I work in London on a live site. And the only way the government can meet these targets is to do perhaps a couple of things. I was also a 90s grad, so I had to work in Singapore because I couldn't find work in London. So I was delivering housing for the Singapore government. They had a 5-year waiting list, and you probably know, it's a one-party state. It's a social contract. Every Singaporean has a birthright to a subsidised government apartment.
I did not know that, no. You're very very generous to my your interpretation of my knowledge base is very generous.
So
but that's fascinating.
The government, so that's a promise, and that's how they keep in power. And then they realised the waiting list was too long, so they panicked and they sucked in all these UK grads straight from uni to shorten the queue.
Right, yeah, gosh.
Now, the only way they hit those targets was to have a twin-track system. So I worked for the Singapore Housing Development Board, and they had their internal planning system. Of course, they had compulsory purchase rights. Singapore can do anything they want. And basically what they did was they just built out all the land,
and it worked.
There was no.
What about? So I understand the compulsory purchase side of it, and I'm untroubled by that. While mildly sympathetic towards people who feel that they're being sort of steamrolled into doing something they wouldn't ordinarily want to do with their own property, but that's where the national interest trumps the personal. What about my concerns with regard to bypassing planning objections? And I'm thinking, well, what if those objections were really valid and important? How are we going to know the difference between the ones we can bypass and the ones that we can't?
So we had a very effective program of council house building up until the late 70s. And that's been replaced by a so-called affordable housing.
Yeah.
So there will be a facility. I'm not saying to have a draconian...
No, I understand.
There will be a facility to listen to valid concerns. But by having... so that's one measure, is to have this twin-track system where we can cut through the sclerotic planning system that the last caller mentioned. And then the second one, my site is only running thanks to Albanians and other people from Eastern Europe who chose to stay. Despite Brexit. They chose to stay because their kids are in school, they're learning English, they're doing very well. And I hear the argument about we're not having the intake of young people into the construction industry, and my company is really acutely aware of that. But unless we introduce this twin-track system that cuts through the red tape, as well as a visa system to lure back the workers who left after Brexit, we will not hit these targets. My company is fighting for the same supply chain all over London.
Okay,
this
is absolutely first-class contribution from almost every caller this hour. I can't remember the last time I had such a pleasurable experience of being ministered to by experts, and the more you listen to experts, the more expertise you accrue yourself. Thank you, Sonny, and thank you for covering so many of the pertinent
problem.
bases. I'm just going to read a message. Go on.
It's only close to my heart because I'm in Milton Keynes. We've got tons of Hong Kong people coming in. It's one of the few good things Boris Johnson did was to invite them in. And I was thinking, what would happen to these people if they didn't have money from selling their flats in Hong Kong? They'd be dead in the water. When I came from Uganda, at least I did wait. I was in a Homes for Heroes prefab, and we waited, and we finally got a council house. But because of that decent shelter over my head, I was able to become an architect, contribute to society, make something, make a contribution. But if I were to come now, I'd have no chance.
Beautifully put, mate, and powerfully put as well. In fact, as Ray says, this is the best hour of radio ever, James. You sat back and let the experts inform us all on a very important issue. I think that's a slightly sort of giving with one hand and taking away with the other, Ray. What about all the hours of radio where I speak almost uninterrupted on a subject of my choosing? Surely they're quite... No? Oh. Rob's in Droitwich Spa. I haven't got any time, Rob, but seeing as Kidderminster Harriers beat you 1-0 the other night in a pre-season friendly, I just wanted to squeeze you in at the end of the programme. Not you,
hi, James.
Not you personally. I don't imagine you were playing for Droitwich Spa, but there you go. Early signs. Give me in 30 seconds what your contribution was going to be.
There's no problem with the planning system in the sense that we have all the legislation in place to deliver all the homes that we need. The problem is with the planning application system and the committee system, because it's run by councillors who are eager for votes from NIMBYs at the end of the day. And we need to change the narrative.
Take the politics out of the equation. Take the politicians out of the equation.
Take the politics. Development on the whole is good. And it seems like...
But not for people with small council-based constituencies that don't want it there, because, I mean, I understand it. I did warn you that I was short of time, but that's another crucial point. That was a real Rubik's Cube of an hour, wasn't it? And look at that. I've got 6 straight faces now. I've done all six sides of the cube are showing up. That was brilliant. Thank you. If you missed any of today's show, you can listen back on Catch Up on Global Player, where you'll also find all of LBC's shows to catch up on, as well as all of Global's live radio stations. Download the Global Player for free from your app store or head to globalplayer.com. Coming up at 4 on LBC, Ben Kentish is standing in for Tom Swarbrick, who's currently standing in for Nick Ferrari, who's on holiday. But here's Sheila Fogarty. 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 But here's Sheila Fogarty.